The morning Thaddeus Crowell rode onto Iron Creek Ranch, he didn't knock. He never knocked. He threw open the gate like he already owned the land, rode straight to the porch steps, and looked down at the woman standing there. This stranger, this outsider, this mail-order bride who had arrived 3 weeks ago with a single battered trunk and the audacity to think she belonged here. And he smiled. Not a kind smile. The kind of smile a man wears when he's already decided how something ends. "Tell your husband," Crowell said, his voice carrying across the yard so every ranch hand could hear, "that a desperate woman and a broken rancher make poor enemies for a man like me." He dropped a folded paper at her feet. Didn't hand it to her. Dropped it. Like she wasn't worth the reach. And then he turned his horse and rode away without looking back. Adeline Voss stood on that porch, the paper at her feet, the wind pulling at her coat, every eye on the ranch watching to see what she would do. She bent down, picked it up, read it, and something inside her went very, very quiet. If you've ever walked into a room where no one wanted you there, if you've ever had to earn something that should have simply been given, then this story is for you. Stay with us until the very end, because what happens next on Iron Creek Ranch will surprise you. And if this is your first time here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story like this one. Drop a like and tell us in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? We want to see how far this story travels. The train station at Billings smelled like coal smoke and wet wool, and Adeline Voss sat in the last seat of the last car with her hands folded in her lap and her heart doing something she refused to call fear. She called it practical concern. That was more manageable. She was 31 years old, which in 1884 felt like a different kind of number than it had at 25. At 25, people still asked her when she planned to marry. At 31, they had stopped asking and started looking at her with that particular expression. Not cruel, just resigned, the way you look at a chair with a broken leg that someone keeps forgetting to throw out. She had spent 6 years as a seamstress in Cincinnati, 3 of those years caring for her ailing mother, and when her mother passed in the spring, Adeline had sat alone in a 2-room apartment with $34 and the sudden, terrifying understanding that she had built her entire life around someone else's survival. She was good at surviving for other people. She had no idea how to do it for herself. The advertisement had found her through a church notice board, which felt almost like a sign, except that Adeline didn't put much stock in signs. She put stock in practical arrangements. A Montana rancher, recently widowed, 2 children, operating a cattle ranch called Iron Creek in a valley settlement named Coldwater Ridge, seeking a capable, hardy woman willing to share the demands of frontier life. Not a romance, a partnership. The honesty of that had caught her attention. Most advertisements dressed themselves up in the language of opportunity and possibility. This one had said plainly, "It will be hard, and I need someone who already knows that." She had written back the same afternoon. Silas Rourke's reply came 3 weeks later, 3 pages in a handwriting that pressed so hard into the paper she could feel the ridges from the other side. He wasn't poetic. He said he had 240 acres, 32 head of cattle, a good horse herd, and 2 children who needed stability more than sentiment. He said the winters were brutal and the nearest doctor was 40 miles away. He said he had tried to manage alone for a year and had learned, slowly and expensively, that one person cannot run a working ranch and raise 2 children at the same time without something breaking. He did not say he was lonely, but Adeline read it in the spaces between his sentences, in the way he described his daughter Mara as quiet in ways I can't always read, and his son Toby as a good boy who asks too many questions I don't know how to answer. She had written back and said yes. Now, sitting in that train car as the Montana landscape opened up around her, enormous and indifferent, all dry grass and distant mountains with snow already sitting on the peaks in September, she wondered exactly what kind of yes she had agreed to. The wagon that met her at the station was driven by a man named Eli, one of the ranch hands, who had clearly drawn the short straw and was not happy about it. He said approximately 14 words during the 2-hour ride to Coldwater Ridge, which gave Adeline plenty of time to watch the valley and understand something fundamental about this place. It did not care about her. That sounds simple, but there's a particular feeling that comes from standing inside a landscape that has existed for thousands of years without you and will exist for thousands more after you're gone. Adeline felt it like a weight across her shoulders the entire ride. The mountains didn't move. The grass didn't soften. The sky was a color that seemed too large to be real. She told herself it was beautiful. She was not sure yet whether she meant it. Coldwater Ridge was 23 buildings arranged around a main road that turned to mud when it rained and to dust when it didn't. There was a general store, a land registry office, a saloon that doubled as the town's only gathering place, and a church that had been built with great optimism and attended with somewhat less. As the wagon rolled through, Adeline was aware of faces turning to watch her, not welcoming faces, assessing ones. She was new. She was from somewhere else. She had arrived in response to a newspaper notice and was about to move into the home of a man she had never met. In Cincinnati, people had opinions about all kinds of things. Here, apparently, they had opinions about her specifically. Two women on the general store steps didn't bother to lower their voices. "That's the one from back east," the taller one said. "She doesn't look like much," said the other. "She doesn't have to look like much. She just has to hold on long enough to get her hands on that waterland." Adeline kept her eyes forward. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't turn. Iron Creek Ranch sat 3 miles south of town, and when it came into view, Adeline made herself see it honestly rather than hopefully. The main house was solid but weathered, gray timber that had been through many winters and showed it. The barn needed paint. 2 of the fence posts along the south pasture were leaning at angles that suggested they'd been leaning for a while. The yard was clean, which told her something, but the overall feeling of the place was of a man who was keeping everything together with both hands and didn't have a third hand to spare for anything extra. Silas Rourke was standing at the gate. She had not known what to expect from him. The letter had given her his practical mind, his directness, his willingness to admit what he needed. What it hadn't given her was the fact that he was taller than she'd imagined, with the kind of face that had been outside in all weathers for a long time and looked like it. He wasn't handsome in a storybook sense. He was something more complicated, a face that had carried a lot of weight and hadn't collapsed under it. He looked at her for a moment with the same assessing expression the town had given her. Then he nodded once. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Rourke," she said. That was the whole of their first conversation. Eli took her trunk inside. Silas showed her the house. The ceremony at the county clerk's office had been arranged for the following morning. That night, Adeline lay in the narrow guest bed listening to the Montana wind move across the valley and thought, "Well, I've done more frightening things." She tried to think of one. She couldn't, quite. The 2 children appeared at breakfast. Toby arrived first, all energy and noise, 6 years old and immediately curious about everything. Her hair, the buttons on her coat, whether she had ever seen a bear. Mara came in after, 10 years old, moving carefully like a person who had learned to take up as little space as possible. She sat across the table from Adeline and said nothing, but her eyes tracked every movement, and they were her father's eyes exactly, assessing, careful, not unkind but not open either. "She doesn't eat a lot," Toby offered, pointing at his sister. "She's been sad." "Toby," Silas said. "It's true. She told me she was sad." "That's not something we tell—" "It's all right," Adeline said. She looked at Mara. "It's hard to lose someone." Mara looked back at her, said nothing. But she also didn't leave the table. The wedding was brief and functional at the county clerk's office, witnessed by 2 people who clearly had other things to do. Silas said the required words in the same tone he probably used to count cattle. Adeline said hers carefully, meaning them in a practical sense, if not a romantic one. The clerk shook their hands and charged them $1.50. Outside on the steps, Silas said, "I want to be honest with you about what this is." "Please," Adeline said. "It's a working arrangement. I need someone capable. You needed a future. That's what we've got." He paused. "I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not." "I wasn't asking you to," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to respect. "All right then," he said. They went back to the ranch. What followed were 3 weeks of the hardest education Adeline had ever received, and she had learned to sew in a cold apartment by lamplight while also nursing a sick woman, so her bar for hard was not low. The ranch work began before sunrise and did not end until dark, and the work itself was physical in ways her Cincinnati muscles were not prepared for. Her hands blistered. Her back ached in places she hadn't known could ache. She fell off a horse in the first week, not dramatically, just slid sideways and landed in the mud, and got up with dirt on her face and the foreman watching from across the yard. Bram Kessler was 42 years old and had been running Iron Creek for 7 years. He was not cruel. He was something worse, in its way, completely certain that she was going to fail. Not maliciously certain, just practically certain, the way you're certain about weather patterns and soil conditions. He watched her with the patient expression of a man who has already calculated when the problem will resolve itself. "She's not going to last," Adeline overheard him tell Wade Hollis, the senior ranch hand. "No offense to her personally, just not built for this kind of life." "Maybe not," Wade said. He was older, quieter, a man who looked like he'd seen several versions of everything and had stopped being surprised by most of it. "But she got back on the horse." Bram had no response to that. Adeline noticed that Wade Hollis always had something to do nearby whenever she was learning something new. He never offered to help. That would have felt like charity, and she wouldn't have taken it anyway. But sometimes he would work a few feet away, and she could watch how he handled something without having to admit she was watching. She learned to ride properly. She learned which knots held in wet weather. She learned that the gray mare with the white foot would try to bite when she was nervous and needed to be approached on the left. She learned that the housekeeper, a compact woman named Mrs. Finch, had organized the kitchen in a system that made complete sense once you understood it and looked like chaos until you did. Mrs. Finch herself was another problem. She had managed the household since shortly after Silas's wife died, and she had the proprietary manner of a person who has made themselves essential and knows it. She wasn't rude to Adeline. She was something more sophisticated. She was perfectly correct and just slightly ahead of Adeline at every turn, answering questions before they were asked, completing tasks before they were requested, moving through the house with an efficiency that made Adeline feel perpetually unnecessary. It was, Adeline realized, deliberate, not viciously deliberate, just a quiet campaign to demonstrate that the household didn't need her. Adeline watched this for a week and then made a decision. She didn't challenge Mrs. Finch's territory. She found different territory. She began taking the accounting books from the desk where they sat in some disorder and going through them in the evenings after supper. Silas noticed on the third night. "Those are the ranch records," he said. "I know," she said. "Do you want me to put them back?" He looked at her for a moment. "Can you read a balance sheet?" "I ran inventory accounts for a garment factory for 2 years. Something crossed his face. "Why didn't you say so?" "You didn't ask what I could do. You asked if I was capable of hard work." She set the pen down. "These supply costs from last March are wrong. Someone charged you twice for the same salt delivery." Silas sat down across the table from her. "Show me." That was the first time they had a conversation that lasted longer than 10 sentences. He wasn't warm exactly. He was still the same man who communicated in the minimum required words. But he was interested. He asked questions. He listened to the answers. And when she pointed out 3 other discrepancies in the accounts, he went quiet in a way that felt like recalculation rather than dismissal. The next evening, he left the accounts on the table with a note that said simply, "What do you think about the spring supply order?" She wrote back a full page. He read it and implemented 3 of her suggestions. Mara had watched all of this from her usual careful distance. The girl said little directly to Adeline, but she wasn't hostile. She was watchful, the way an animal watches something it hasn't yet decided about. Adeline didn't push. She helped with homework when Mara brought it to the table, answered questions when they were asked, and otherwise left space for the girl to make her own approach on her own schedule. Toby had no such restraint. By the end of the second week, he had shown Adeline every corner of the barn, introduced her to each horse by name and temperament, explained in great detail why the rooster was untrustworthy, and asked whether she thought a person could teach a barn cat to do tricks. "I don't know," Adeline said. "Have you tried?" "I tried," Toby said gravely. "The cat had opinions about it." "Cats usually do." He grinned at that, a big, uncomplicated grin that reminded her suddenly and sharply of why any of this was worth doing. Not the land, not the practical arrangement, not the reasonable answer to an unreasonable situation. But a 6-year-old boy who still thought the world was mostly interesting and who needed someone to be steady in it. She could be steady. That she knew. It was at the end of her 3rd week on Iron Creek that Thaddeus Crowell arrived. She had heard the name in town during the 2 visits she'd made with Silas for supplies. Crowell. The way people said it told you everything. A kind of careful flatness that people use when they respect power they don't fully trust. He owned the largest ranch in the Northern Valley, had water rights to 3 of the major creeks feeding the grazing lands, and had been the dominant force in Coldwater Ridge for close to 15 years. His name came up in conversation the way weather came up, not because anyone particularly wanted to discuss it, but because it was simply a condition of life in this valley. She had not expected him at the ranch. She was in the yard when he arrived, mending a bridle that had snapped the previous day. She heard the sound of multiple horses and looked up to see Crowell and 2 of his men coming through the gate. Crowell was perhaps 55, thick through the chest, with a face that was probably considered distinguished in polite company and felt, up close, like a door being closed in your face. He was the kind of man who moved like he had never once in his life had to consider whether he was welcome somewhere. He rode up to the porch and stopped, looking down at her. "Where's Rourke?" he said. Not to her specifically, just toward her, the way you speak toward furniture. "He's at the north pasture," she said. "Can I help you?" Crowell looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man who has just been answered by someone he hadn't considered capable of speech. Then he turned to his men and said something she couldn't hear, and one of them laughed. "You're the mail order wife," Crowell said. It wasn't a question. It was the specific inflection of a man categorizing something. "I'm Mrs. Rourke," she said. He smiled, as she would later understand it, that smile. "Tell your husband I came by." He pulled out the folded paper then, didn't lean down to hand it to her, let it drop from his fingers and fall to the ground between his horse's hooves and her feet. "Make sure he reads that carefully," Crowell said. "Tell him I'm a patient man, but patience runs out." Then he turned and left, the 2 men behind him, and the gate swung shut on its hinge and the yard was quiet again. Adeline stood there for a moment. Around the yard she could feel the presence of the ranch hands who had seen this. Eli by the water trough, 2 others near the barn door, all of them watching to see what she would do. She was aware of being watched the way you're aware of a temperature change. It prickled across her skin. She bent down and picked up the paper. She read it. It was a formal offer to purchase Iron Creek Ranch for a sum that was— she would check this against the records later, but she already had a reasonable sense of the numbers. Approximately a third of what the property was actually worth. At the bottom, in handwriting that was almost elegant, "This offer expires November 1st. After that, we will be renegotiating under different terms." She folded the paper, put it in her apron pocket. When Silas returned 2 hours later, she handed it to him at the door without preamble, watched him read it, watched his jaw set in a way she was beginning to understand meant he was getting control of something he didn't want to say in front of her. "Crowell," he said, "I assumed—" "Did he threaten you?" "He was precise about it." Silas looked at the paper again, then at her. "This isn't—" He stopped, started again. "This is going to get more complicated before it gets better." "I gathered that from the tone," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him resorting something behind his eyes, calibrating maybe, against the woman who had stood in his yard while Thaddeus Crowell dropped papers at her feet and had come inside with the paper in her pocket and the problem in her voice rather than tears on her face. "How much do you know about Crowell?" she asked. "Enough to know fighting him directly goes badly." "Then we won't fight him directly," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean?" Adeline thought about the account books, about the supply chains, the water rights notations she'd found in the records, the way the valley's geography had arranged itself in her mind over 3 weeks of watching and listening. "It means," she said carefully, "that I'd like to understand who he needs to keep happy, because a man with that much power still needs people to hold his power for him, and those people have reasons for their choices." She paused. "People with reasons can be reached. They can be given better reasons." Silas stared at her. "You've been here 3 weeks, he said. "I read quickly," she said. He looked at the paper in his hand, at her, at the window and the darkening valley outside it. "All right," he said finally, quietly. "Talk." She pulled out the account books. She had already begun to build a map of the relationships she'd traced through the records, through conversations overheard in town, through the names that came up in context and the patterns between them. She spread it across the table between them like a woman who had been quietly preparing for exactly this conversation. And Silas Rourke, who had spent a year trying to hold everything together with both hands, sat across from his 3-week wife and listened to her talk. And somewhere in the middle of it, she couldn't have said exactly when, The distance between them closed by about half. Not all the way, not even close, but half. Outside, the Montana wind came down from the mountains and moved across the dark valley, and the first thin edge of what would become winter began its slow approach toward Iron Creek. Neither of them noticed. They were too busy figuring out how to save it. The map Adeline had spread across the kitchen table that first night stayed in her mind long after Silas rolled it up and tucked it beside the account books. Not a literal map, just the one she'd been building in her head, relationship by relationship, name by name, the invisible architecture of who owed what to whom and why it mattered. She had learned, in her years running inventory accounts for a garment factory with a notoriously difficult owner, that the official version of any arrangement was rarely the whole story. The real story lived in the gaps, in who paid late, who asked for extensions, who quietly covered someone else's mistake and expected something in return. Coldwater Ridge had the same structure. It just used cattle and water rights instead of bolts of fabric. The morning after Crowell's visit, she woke before the household and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that was still too hot to drink and wrote out everything she knew in plain columns on a spare page from the back of the household ledger. Names on the left, what each person wanted on the right, what they owed Crowell or feared from him or had been quietly promised by him in the middle. Thaddeus Crowell, Northern Valley water rights, the largest grazing acreage in the county, ambitions she was still mapping. Needed Iron Creek because of its position between the Upper Creek systems and the Southern Passage. Not greed exactly, strategic acquisition, the kind of thinking that had probably been 15 years in the building. Orson Vale controlled the southern road access. Mid-sized operation, reliable income, but Adeline had noticed his name twice in the supply records attached to transactions that didn't quite add up. Crowell's man? Probably, but out of necessity rather than loyalty. Those were different things. Caleb Danner, timber operation on the Western Ridge, supplied half the valley with lumber and fence posts, had worked alongside Crowell for 2 decades. His name came up the way an old dog's name comes up. Assumed, present, loyal by default. She stared at the page for a long time. Then she wrote, at the bottom, in smaller letters, "Loyalty bought by fear looks identical to loyalty. Until something changes the math." Silas found her there when he came down at 5:30. He looked at what she'd written and stood behind her in silence for a moment, reading it. "You got up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep." He poured his own coffee and sat across from her. He had that careful look on his face, the one she was coming to recognize as him deciding how much to say. He wasn't a man who talked for the sake of talking, which she actually appreciated. When Silas Rourke said something, he'd decided to say it. "I've known Orson Vale for 12 years, he said. "He's not a bad man." "I didn't say he was." "But you think Crowell has him?" "I think Crowell has made it easier for him to go along than to push back." She tapped the column on the right side of her page. "That's different from believing in something. That's just economics." Silas looked at her over his coffee cup. "You think like a businessman." "I think like someone who spent a lot of years watching people make decisions based on what's in front of them rather than what's right." She paused. "That's not a criticism of them. It's just how people work." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the first sounds of the ranch, starting its day, began to filter through the walls. Boots on the porch, the distant movement of horses. "Crowell's been trying to acquire this land for 3 years, Silas said. "Before my wife died, he came to us with an offer. She told him no. He was polite about it." He looked at his hands. "He got less polite after she was gone." Adeline absorbed this. "He waited until you were vulnerable. He's patient. He's calculated," she said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite anger but was adjacent to it. A coldness that surprised even her a little, sitting there in the early morning kitchen. She had not come to Montana to fight anyone. She had come because she needed somewhere to be. But something about that folded paper dropped in the dirt, the way he had looked through her rather than at her, had settled into a place under her ribs that was going to be difficult to ignore. "The offer expires November 1st, she said. 7 weeks. Then we have 7 weeks to make it not worth his trouble to continue." She looked up at him. "Or to make his allies decide the trouble isn't worth it to them." Silas studied her. He did that, really looked at her, the way most people didn't bother to look at someone they'd already categorized. She'd noticed it in the first days and wasn't sure yet if it was trust or skepticism. Probably both. Adeline, he said, first time he'd used her name without the formal prefix. What exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing we find out what Crowell has told Orson Vale and Caleb Danner that isn't true, she said. Because a man who operates the way he operates has almost certainly told them what he needs them to believe rather than what's actually happening. And if we can show them the difference, she stopped. People don't like being used, even people who've allowed themselves to be used. There's a difference between choosing something and discovering you were maneuvered into it. Silas was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "There's a woman in town, Lenora Bell. She's married to the land registrar." Adeline waited. "She and my wife were friends," he said, "before." He set down his coffee. "She's never liked Crowell, but her husband does business with him, and she's careful about what she says in public." "But not entirely silent," Adeline said. "She came to my wife sometimes, when things bothered her." He looked away. "I don't know if she'd talk to you." "Would she talk to another woman who is also finding this valley somewhat less welcoming than expected?" Adeline said. Something shifted in his face that was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him. Not quite a smile, more like the moment before one. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe she would." She went to town 3 days later on the pretext of picking up a supply order, which was true enough. There was a supply order. But she timed the trip for Tuesday morning, when she had noticed from 2 prior visits that Lenora Bell sat at the table outside the general store between 10 and 11 when the weather permitted, drinking tea and reading whatever she could get her hands on. The habit of a woman with a good mind and not quite enough to occupy it. Adeline bought her supplies. She came back outside. She sat down at the other end of the table with a cup of tea she'd purchased inside and a copy of a newspaper that was 2 weeks old and said nothing at all. Lenora Bell was perhaps 45, slight, with quick eyes and the composed expression of someone who had decided some time ago that composure was the most useful armor available to her. She glanced at Adeline once, then back at her book. 5 minutes passed. Then Lenora said, without looking up, "You're Silas Rourke's wife." "I am," Adeline said. Another minute. "Crowell came to your ranch last week," Lenora said, still not looking up. "He did." "Did he make you cry?" The directness of it startled Adeline into honesty. "No." Now Lenora looked up. She studied Adeline with those quick eyes for a moment. "He made the last woman cry. That was the Henderson girl, married the Marsh boy 3 years back. Crowell came to them with an offer, and she cried, and they sold." She paused. "He considers it efficient." "I imagine he does." Lenora looked at her a moment longer. Then she turned a page in her book. "My husband processes the land documents for the county," she said, as if she were reading from the page rather than speaking to Adeline. "All of them. Offers, surveys, transfers, disputes." Another page turned, though Adeline doubted she was reading. "A man in that position sees a great deal." "I imagine he does," Adeline said again, carefully. "He's a thorough man, keeps copies of everything." Lenora's voice was entirely neutral. "He has a habit of leaving his work on the desk in the evening before supper. He's very organized, alphabetical." She closed her book, stood up, looked at Adeline with an expression that was composed and careful, and underneath it something that had been waiting a very long time to not have to stay quiet. "It was nice to meet you, Mrs. Rourke. I hope you'll come to the Tuesday social next week. Most of the Valley women attend." She went inside. Adeline sat with her tea and her old newspaper and thought about alphabetical filing systems and the specific weight of what had just happened. She went home and told Silas. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to understand as a sign that he was taking something seriously. "She's telling you to look at his files," Silas said. "She's telling me where they are," Adeline said. "I'm not suggesting we take anything." "But you want to read them." "I want to know what's in them." He stood up, walked to the window, stood there with his back to her for long enough that she began to wonder if she'd miscalculated something. Then he turned around. "Harold Bell processes every document in this county," Silas said, "including the survey records for Iron Creek, including any offers or transfers or contested claims." He paused. "If Crowell has done anything through official channels that isn't quite right, it would be in those files," she said. "And if Harold Bell has been cooperative with Crowell, Then there may be things in those files that Harold Bell would prefer not to become public knowledge. Silas looked at her for a long moment. You're talking about leverage. I'm talking about information, she said carefully. What a person does with information is a choice they make. He rubbed the back of his neck, which she'd come to understand as his version of complicated feelings he was working through. This could go wrong, he said. If Crowell finds out we've been looking into him, he won't wait until November. I know. And Lenora Bell could be setting a trap. She could be working for him. She could be, Adeline said, but I don't think she is. Based on what? Based on the fact that she mentioned a woman who cried, Adeline said. Crowell wouldn't have told her that. She was telling me something she'd seen, and she was angry about it in a way she'd been holding for a while. Silas was quiet. Then, how do you know that? Because I know what it looks like when a woman has been holding something quiet for a long time and finally finds someone she can say it to sideways, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Something shifted behind his eyes. The same recalibration she'd seen before, like he kept having to update a calculation about her. All right, he said. What do we do? What they did was patient and careful and mostly unglamorous. Adeline attended the Tuesday social, where she was received with the specific social temperature of a place that hasn't decided about you yet. Not cold, not warm, about 60 degrees and slightly damp. She listened more than she spoke. She remembered names. She noticed which women's eyes tracked to the same corner of the room when Crowell's name came up, the particular stillness that settled over certain conversations when his business dealings were mentioned. She also helped a farmer's wife named Dottie Hatch piece together a quilt pattern that Dottie had been struggling with for a month, because Adeline had spent 6 years in the garment trade and the geometry of fabric was something she could do in her sleep. Word of this spread, as word does in small places, and 3 weeks after arriving in Coldwater Ridge as a suspicious stranger, Adeline had become, not accepted exactly, but useful. People will tolerate a great deal in someone who makes themselves useful. Meanwhile, Silas quietly commissioned an independent survey of Iron Creek's water rights, which cost money they didn't particularly have, but which he paid for out of the emergency fund his wife had kept, a decision Adeline only learned about afterward, and which told her something about how Silas made decisions when something mattered enough. The surveyor was a methodical man from Billings named Garrett, who took 2 weeks and came back with findings that Silas read standing up at the kitchen table, one hand on the back of a chair, face going through several distinct expressions in sequence. What does it say? Adeline asked. He turned the document around and pushed it toward her. Iron Creek's water rights, properly surveyed and documented, were assessed at a value nearly 3 times what Crowell's offer had proposed. The property's position between the Upper Creek systems and the Southern Pass made it arguably the most strategically significant piece of land in the valley for grazing access. Not the largest, not the most productive acre by acre, but the one that controlled passage and water distribution for nearly half the other operations in the county. Adeline read this twice. He didn't offer a third of what it was worth, she said. No. He offered less than 1/10 of what it's strategically worth to him. Yes. She set the document down. And he had to know that. He would have had this surveyed himself before he made any offer. He knew exactly what he was proposing. Yes, Silas said again. His voice was very controlled in the way it gets when a person is managing something they'd like very much to not manage quietly. Then Orson Vale and Caleb Danner, she said slowly, they've been told something about this land that isn't accurate. Because if they knew what this survey shows, they'd understand that Crowell acquiring Iron Creek changes the entire valley structure, including their position in it. Silas looked at her. He's not just trying to buy a ranch, she said. He's trying to consolidate the entire water access system. With Iron Creek, he controls when every other rancher in the lower valley can water their herds. He could make Vale's road access meaningless by redirecting the seasonal grazing patterns. He could squeeze Danner's timber operation by making the spring routes through here conditional. She stopped. They're not his allies. They're his next targets. They just don't know it yet. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Toby could be heard in the yard, having an argument with the rooster about something. If we show Vale and Danner this survey, Silas said carefully, along with what Crowell actually intends, we give them a better reason, Adeline said. That's all. We don't have to threaten anyone. We just have to show them what they've been missing. And if they tell Crowell? Then we've already lost, and we might as well know it now, she said. But I don't think they will. Because the other thing this survey shows is that Crowell's offered price would also significantly undervalue Vale's road access rights and Danner's Ridge easements once Iron Creek's true position is established. He's been telling them a story in which they all profit together. This survey tells a different story. Silas picked up the document again. Read it a third time, carefully, the way he did things that mattered. I'll ride to Vale tomorrow, he said. I'd like to come, Adeline said. He looked up. Vale is going to want to know what kind of woman would think to have this survey done, she said simply. I'd rather he meet her than hear about her. Silas considered this. Then, that almost smile again. Fair point, he said. Orson Vale was a heavy, slow-moving man who had the particular stillness of someone who had survived by being less visible than the people around him. He received them on his porch with the wariness of a man who has learned that unexpected visitors usually want something from him, and heard Silas out with an expression that gave away almost nothing. Then Silas put the survey on the table. Vale read it. His stillness changed character. Same physical stillness, different interior. This is the Garrett survey, he said. Commissioned and paid for, Silas said. And you think Crowell knows this? We think Crowell had the same survey done before he made his offer, Adeline said. It was the first time she'd spoken, and Vale looked at her with a measuring expression. He wouldn't have made a formal offer without understanding what he was acquiring. You're saying he lied to me, Vale said. I'm saying he may have given you an incomplete picture of what changes once he acquires Iron Creek, Adeline said, specifically regarding the seasonal grazing routes through the southern pass, and what controlling those routes would mean for your road access revenues. Vale looked at the survey again. She watched him do the math. It didn't take him long. When he looked up, his face had a different quality to it. A kind of flatness that wasn't neutrality, but was something colder. How long have you known about this? He said to Silas. The survey was finished 4 days ago. You came to me first. Yes. Vale was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Adeline with that measuring expression again. Where are you from, Mrs. Rourke? Cincinnati, she said. You have family and cattle operations? No, garment trade. He looked at her for another moment, as if trying to resolve something. How does a garment woman from Cincinnati understand water access rights in a Montana valley she's been in for less than 2 months? I read the account books, she said, and I listened carefully. Something in his face shifted, very slightly, the way a door shifts when someone on the other side of it finally decides to open it. Leave me the survey, he said to Silas. I'll need to look at this properly. They left it. They were halfway back to Iron Creek when Silas said, quietly, He's going to verify it. Good, Adeline said. He should. We want him to verify it. 2 days later, Bram Kessler came to Adeline in the yard with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the patient, calculating skepticism he usually aimed at her, but something tighter and more urgent. There's a problem, he said. She waited. Someone cut the north fence line last night. 3 sections. The cattle in the upper pasture are loose. She felt the information land. How many head? Maybe 20 drifted before Wade found it this morning. Where's Silas? Riding fence on the south property. He doesn't know yet. She looked at the barn, at the yard, made quick calculations about who was here and who was where and what needed to happen in what order. Get Eli and the 2 Patterson boys moving on the north. I'll go find Silas. Bram looked at her with that new expression. Mrs. Rourke, he said. It wasn't an accident. She met his eyes. Someone cut that fence, he said. Deliberately. Clean cuts, not wear. Wade checked. She held his gaze. Then we fix the fence, we find the cattle, and we don't give whoever did this the satisfaction of it looking worse than it is. She paused. Go. He went. She went and found Silas and told him riding alongside him on the gray mare with the white foot, who had stopped trying to bite her 3 weeks ago. Silas's face did that controlled anger thing again as he listened. Crowell, he said. Probably, but we have no proof. Adeline, I know, she said. But if we ride at Crowell with accusations and no proof, he goes to the county magistrate, and we look like frightened ranchers making trouble. We need evidence. He was quiet, which meant he agreed and didn't like it. They found 18 of the 20 head by midday. The other 2 turned up the following morning, having wandered 2 miles northeast and been found by a neighboring rancher named Prescott, who brought them back with the slightly too careful expression of someone who wants credit for being decent without having to take a position. Adeline thanked him warmly, offered him coffee, asked about his operation, let him talk for 40 minutes about the difficulties of the season, and listened, and remembered everything he said, and filed it in the map she kept building in her head. The fence cutting was followed 5 days later by the grain sacks. 12 bags of winter grain stored in the secondary barn were found slashed, and the grain contaminated with something that smelled like lye. 230 pounds of winter feed, ruined. Wade Hollis found it in the morning and came to tell Adeline before he told Silas, which she registered without commenting on it. Something had shifted in how the ranch hands moved around her after the fence line situation. Not dramatically, just differently. "We'll need to replace it before the snow," she said. "Yes, ma'am. He paused. "That's going to be expensive this late in the season." "I know." She thought for a moment. "Wade, is there a feed operation in Millhaven?" Millhaven was 20 miles east, past Crowell's influence in the valley. "There's Hutchins' feed. He deals mostly with the eastern ranches." "Would he sell to us?" "I expect he'd sell to anyone with money," Wade said. "Then I need to go to Millhaven," she said. Silas objected to her going alone. She pointed out that Silas going would look like desperation, and that a woman making a feed purchase looked considerably less alarming than the rancher himself. This argument took 15 minutes. She went. Hutchins turned out to be a cheerful, red-faced man who was delighted to have new business and entirely unaware of, or uninterested in, valley politics. She purchased enough grain to see them through early winter and arranged for delivery the following week. While she was there, she stopped at the Millhaven land office on the pretext of confirming some survey boundaries. And while she was there, it was a small office, one clerk, the kind of place where conversation fills the silence easily. She heard something that she carried home with her like a coal in a tin box, careful not to let it go cold. The Millhaven clerk, making conversation, mentioned that a filing had come through from Coldwater Ridge the previous spring regarding Iron Creek's eastern water boundary. A routine document, he said, except that it had come with an attached assessment that the Coldwater registrar, Harold Bell, had certified as accurate, and the figures in that assessment were the same figures Crowell had used in his offer. Not similar figures. The same figures, down to the last decimal point. Adeline rode home in the early dark with the Montana wind pushing at her back and thought about Harold Bell's alphabetical filing system and Lenora Bell's carefully neutral voice and the specific legal weight of a certified county document with wrong numbers in it. She told Silas that evening. He sat with it for a long time. "If the county document uses falsified survey values," he said slowly, "and Bell certified them, then Crowell has a paper trail," she said, "and so does Bell, and both of them would very much prefer that paper trail stayed quiet." "This is bigger than a land dispute," Silas said. "Yes. If we push this, it could—" "I know. Crowell has friends at the county level, possibly further than that." "I know," she said again, "but Silas, he cut your fences. He ruined your grain. He is going to keep doing it until November 1st, and if you don't sign by November 1st, he's going to do something worse." Silas looked at his hands. "He's counting on you being alone in this," Adeline said, more quietly. "He's counting on Vale being his, and Danner being his, and the town being afraid of him, and you having no one to stand beside you who knows what he's actually done." She paused. "We need to show Lenora Bell what we found, and then we need her to decide what to do about it." "You're asking a woman to act against her husband," Silas said. "I'm giving her information she can make her own choice with," Adeline said. "She already knows something is wrong. I could hear it. She just doesn't know how wrong." He looked up at her. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen from him before. Something that went past the careful assessment and the controlled practicality into somewhere more unguarded. It lasted only a moment. Then he looked away. "She might go to Bell," he said. "She might," Adeline said. "That would end everything." "Yes." Silence. Outside, a horse moved in the barn. The wind pushed at the shutters. "Do you trust her?" Silas asked. Adeline thought about a woman sitting at a table outside a general store, turning pages in a book she wasn't reading, saying he considers it efficient in a voice that had been keeping its anger at a careful temperature for a very long time. "Yes," she said. Why? Because she's been waiting for someone to bring her the right information, Adeline said. She's not afraid of doing something difficult. She's afraid of doing something difficult for the wrong reasons, without enough to stand on. She met Silas's eyes. We can give her enough to stand on. Silas was quiet for so long that she thought he was going to say no. Then he stood up. I'll get the Garrett survey, he said. She went back to Lenora Bell the following Tuesday. Not at the outdoor table this time. The weather had turned, the first real cold of the coming season pressing down from the mountains. Adeline knocked on the Bells' front door, which was a deliberate choice, a different kind of conversation than the one conducted sideways over teacups in public. Lenora answered, looked at her, stepped back to let her in without a word. They sat in the front parlor, which was the room of a woman with good taste and insufficient outlet for it. Lenora poured tea with a steady hand and said nothing, waiting. Adeline put the Garrett survey on the table. Beside it, the notes she'd made about the Millhaven filing and the certified assessment values. Lenora looked at them. She picked up the survey first. Read it carefully. Set it down. Picked up the notes. Read those. Her face was entirely composed throughout, which Adeline had come to understand was not blankness, but control. The specific kind of control that has been practiced until it's reflex. When she finished, she set everything down and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the wall for a long moment. My husband certified those assessment values, she said. Yes. He would have compared them to the survey on file at the county office. Yes. Which means either the survey on file was already falsified before it reached him, or… She stopped. Or he knew, Adeline said very quietly. Lenora's jaw tightened. It was the first physical thing she'd let show. How long have you been here, Mrs. Rourke? 9 weeks. 9 weeks. She looked at Adeline with an expression that was complicated in ways that would have taken a long time to fully map. You came here as a mail-order bride, and in 9 weeks, you've built a case against the most powerful man in this valley. I had help, Adeline said, and I had motivation. Yes. Lenora looked at the documents again. So did he. Her voice was perfectly steady. My husband is not a bad man, Mrs. Rourke. He is a frightened one. There's a difference. Crowell came to him 6 years ago with an offer that was, in the language he used, an opportunity. And Harold took it because there were reasons. She stopped. That doesn't make it right. No, Adeline agreed, but it changes what's possible. Lenora looked up. If he came forward voluntarily, it would be different than if the documents were simply discovered, Adeline said carefully. They looked at each other. I have children, Lenora said. Daughters. I know. If this goes wrong, I know. Another silence. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. Lenora Bell picked up the documents, squared their edges carefully, and held them for a moment. Then she set them back on the table in front of Adeline. I'll need a few days, she said. All right. I'll need to speak with Harold. All right. Lenora stood. Adeline stood. They were the same height, which Adeline hadn't noticed before. Mrs. Rourke, Lenora said, the women in this town have been waiting 2 months to decide whether to like you. I've noticed. I think that's over, she said. And for the first time, something came through that composed surface that wasn't controlled at all. I'm glad you came to Coldwater Ridge. Adeline drove home through the early cold with the mountains standing enormous and indifferent against the sky. And she thought about the surveyor's numbers and Orson Vale's face doing the math, and Lenora Bell's voice finally saying the things she'd been not saying for years. And she thought about the fact that she had arrived here with a battered trunk and almost no money and a stomach full of practical concern, and something had shifted in her that she couldn't quite name. She wasn't afraid of Coldwater Ridge anymore. She wasn't afraid of Crowell. She was watching the things she'd been building take shape, piece by piece, like a garment whose pattern finally makes sense once enough of it is assembled. And underneath the fear and the work and the constant awareness of how badly it could still go wrong, she felt something she recognized from her best days in Cincinnati. The days when she'd fixed a problem no one else could see the answer to. She felt like herself. When she got back to Iron Creek, Silas was waiting on the porch despite the cold. He watched her pull the gray mare into the yard and watched her dismount. More smoothly than she had 2 months ago, because everything she did here she'd done enough times now to feel the difference. And when she looked up at him from the yard, he had that expression on his face again, the unguarded one, the one that only appeared in small moments and then retreated. "How did it go?" he said. "She needs a few days," Adeline said. She tied the mare. "I think she'll do it." He nodded slowly. Then from inside the house came the sound of Toby, very loud, demanding to know if supper was happening, and Mara's voice telling him to stop being a disaster, and Silas's face shifted into something almost warm. "Come inside," he said. "It's cold." She went inside, and the house, which had felt like someone else's home for 9 weeks, wrapped around her like it had been waiting for her to stop noticing the difference. Lenora Bell took 4 days, not a few. Adeline counted them without meaning to, the way you count things you're trying not to count, marking each morning by its absence of news and each evening by the same. She kept herself busy, which wasn't difficult on a working ranch in October. The days were shortening fast now, the light going thin and sharp the way it does in Montana when summer finally stops pretending. There was always fence to check, always accounts to balance, always some problem that had been waiting its turn to become urgent. She worked. She listened. She kept her face neutral when Silas came in from the north pasture with that tight look that meant he'd found something else wrong and was deciding how to tell her. The water trough near the east barn was contaminated on the 3rd day. Wade found it before the horses drank from it, which was the only piece of luck in the whole situation. He'd noticed the color was off and had the presence of mind to pull the horses back and come find Adeline before he found Silas. She wasn't sure when that had become a pattern, the hands coming to her first, but it had. She went and looked at the trough. The smell told her most of what she needed to know. "Same as the grain," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She stood there for a moment with her hands in her coat pockets, looking at 40 gallons of ruined water, and thought about the particular kind of cruelty it took to poison an animal's water source. Not dramatic cruelty, methodical cruelty. The kind that understood logistics and intended to wear something down rather than break it all at once. "Drain it and scrub it down," she said. "We'll use the creek trough for the east horses until this one's clean. That's going to add an hour to the morning rotation." "I know, do it anyway." She went and told Silas. His face went through that sequence again. The controlled anger, the calculation, the forced patience. He walked out to look at it himself, which she understood was less about doubting her assessment and more about needing to see it with his own eyes. Some things you had to see yourself before you could fully believe them. He stood at the trough for a long time without saying anything. "He's escalating," Silas finally said. "Yes. November 1st is 3 weeks out." "I know." He turned to look at her. "Adeline, if Lenora Bell doesn't come through, she'll come through." "You can't know that." "No, honestly. But I know what I heard in her voice, and I know that a woman who has been waiting to do something right for a long time doesn't let the opportunity go when it finally arrives." She paused. "She's managing her husband, Silas. That takes time. Give her the time." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she still hadn't fully categorized. Not quite the assessing look anymore, something that had moved past assessment into somewhere less comfortable and less controlled. "All right," he said. Lenora came on the 4th day. She didn't come to the ranch. She sent a message through Dottie Hatch, delivered with the elaborate casualness of someone who had been specifically instructed to be casual about it, asking if Adeline might stop by the Bell house at her convenience. Adeline went that afternoon. Harold Bell was there. She hadn't expected that, and for one cold second in the doorway she thought, "This is wrong. This is the trap Silas worried about. He's going to tell me that Crowell knows everything and the land transfer is already filed." But Harold Bell was a small man with a neat mustache and the collapsed expression of someone who has been through a very difficult conversation and come out the other side into a kind of exhausted relief. He stood when Adeline came in and shook her hand and sat back down heavily, like the standing had cost him something. "My wife has explained the situation," he said. He had the precise, slightly formal speech of a man who deals in official documents. "I want to be clear about what happened." Adeline sat down across from him. Lenora was in the chair beside him, her hands folded, her composure perfectly maintained except for a slight tension around her eyes that Adeline recognized as the look of someone who has recently won an argument that mattered enormously. "I'm listening," Adeline said. Harold laid it out. 6 years ago, Crowell had come to him with what he'd called a streamlining proposal, a pre-certified survey assessment for a set of properties in the valley that Harold would simply incorporate into the official records rather than conducting individual assessments. It would save the county time and money, Crowell had explained. It was efficient, and there was a fee for Harold's cooperation, paid privately, enough to cover his daughter's schooling in Billings and a medical debt from Lenora's difficult pregnancy 2 years prior. Harold had told himself the surveys were accurate. He had not looked at them carefully enough to know whether they were or not, and by the time he understood that they were not, that the valuations were systematically low by a factor that benefited Crowell's acquisition strategy directly, he was already 6 months into an arrangement he couldn't see a clean way out of. He had kept quiet because he was afraid. He had kept the documents because he was thorough. He had, in the end, told Lenora because she had asked him directly whether something was wrong, and Harold Bell was, at his core, a man who could not lie to his wife. "There are 7 properties," Harold said. "Iron Creek is one of them. The others include the marshland, which Crowell already acquired, and 4 others he has under various stages of pressure." He paused. "And one belonging to Caleb Danner." Adeline went very still. "Danner doesn't know," Harold said. "His timber operation sits on a ridge easement that Crowell's survey understated by nearly half its real value. If Danner ever investigated the actual boundary of his operation, he'd find he has legal claim to significantly more of the western ridge than he currently uses." He looked at his hands. "Crowell has been planning to use that discrepancy to force Danner out once he secures the valley water access. Danner thinks he's Crowell's partner. He's actually his next acquisition." The room was very quiet. Adeline thought about Caleb Danner, who she had seen twice at a distance in town. A weathered man in his late 50s, the kind of solidity that comes from 20 years of outdoor physical work, always nodding at Crowell with the ease of long friendship. She thought about what it would feel like to discover that a man you'd trusted for 2 decades had been systematically setting you up. "Will you put this in writing?" she said. Harold looked at Lenora. Something passed between them, the quick wordless communication of 2 people who have talked something to its conclusion. "Yes," Harold said. "It won't be easy for you." "No." He folded his hands. "But it will be easier than continuing to be what I've been for 6 years. He said it quietly, without drama. Just a fact, sitting on the table between them. Adeline looked at Lenora. Lenora looked back at her with an expression that was warm and tired and completely resolute. "What do you need from us?" Lenora said. What she needed, specifically, was a certified copy of the original county assessment filings, with Harold's notation confirming the discrepancy, which Harold produced from his home filing cabinet, the same alphabetically organized system Lenora had described obliquely on that first Tuesday, within 20 minutes. She also needed time to reach Caleb Danner before Crowell had any reason to suspect that his arrangement with the county registrar had come apart. She rode home with the documents inside her coat, against her chest, and the weight of them felt heavier than paper should. Silas read them at the kitchen table that evening. Mara had gone to bed. Toby had fallen asleep in the chair by the fireplace in the way 6-year-olds do, completely and suddenly, like a lamp being switched off. Silas read in silence for a long time, while Adeline sat across from him and drank coffee that went cold in her cup. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at the fireplace. "He's been running this scheme for 6 years, he said. "Yes." 7 properties. The marshland is already gone. "Yes." "Danner." He said the name with a particular weight. "I've had disputes with Danner over the ridge boundary. We weren't friendly." "I know." "He helped Crowell pressure us." "He did." She paused. "He also didn't know Crowell was planning to do the same to him." Silas was quiet. "Silas," she said, "he needs to hear this from us before Crowell has any reason to warn him or discredit what we have." "I know." "He's going to be angry." "I know." "Not at us, necessarily, but angry at the situation, which is going to come out sideways." "I've dealt with Caleb Danner when he's angry," Silas said. "I'll manage." He looked up at her. "Will you come?" She thought of what she'd said to Silas before the visit to Vale. Vale is going to want to know what kind of woman would think to have this survey done, and thought that Danner was going to want to know something similar, and that in this case, unlike with Vale, the answer might land differently. Danner had a history with Iron Creek that wasn't friendly. Adding a new wife to the equation was either a complication or an advantage. She decided it was an advantage because the alternative was that it was a complication and she couldn't afford complications right now. "Yes," she said. They rode to Danner's timber operation the following morning, early, before the work crews were fully active. Danner met them in the yard with his foreman and a watchful expression that said he'd already noted something unusual about an unscheduled visit from his not particularly friendly neighbor and the neighbor's new wife. "Rourke," he said, looked at Adeline. "Mrs. Rourke." "Caleb," Silas said. "We need to talk." "About what?" "About Thaddeus Crowell," Silas said, "and about your ridge easement." Something flickered in Danner's face. "My easement's fine." "It's better than fine," Adeline said. That's the problem." He looked at her properly for the first time, not dismissively. She'd learned to read the difference now between the look that didn't see her and the look that was genuinely uncertain what to make of her. This was the latter. "Come inside," he said finally. The telling of it took 40 minutes. Silas laid out the survey findings, and Adeline filled in the documented evidence, and she watched Caleb Danner's face move through a sequence of expressions that reminded her of ice on a creek in early thaw, the solid surface holding, and then the moment it doesn't. The moment for Danner was when Harold Bell's certified notation confirmed that the easement assessment on his western ridge had been systematically understated for 6 years. He stood up from the table, walked to the window, stood there with his back to them for a long time. 22 years, he said. Neither Adeline nor Silas said anything. "I've known Thaddeus Crowell for 22 years. His voice was very flat. Not the controlled flatness of someone managing their emotions, but the flatness that comes when something has been hollowed out. "I rode with him through the winter of '71. I lent him money when his operation was struggling. He stopped. "I was going to use my ridge access to force me out after he had the water rights." "That's what the documents indicate," Adeline said. "He was going to take everything I have, and he smiled at me while he was planning it." He said this to the window. "For 6 years he smiled at me." She let him have the silence. Some things needed a moment of oxygen before you could talk around them. Danner turned around. His face had reorganized itself into something hard and purposeful. "What do you need?" "Your testimony about what Crowell told you regarding Iron Creek and your shared arrangement," Silas said, "and your willingness to speak to a county investigator if it comes to that." "Oh, it'll come to that," Danner said. "I'll make sure of it." He said it with a quiet certainty that told Adeline exactly why Crowell had kept him as an ally for 2 decades. The man's loyalty, once given, was comprehensive and durable. The fact that Crowell had never understood what he was holding, treating a man's genuine loyalty as just another asset to exploit, struck her as both the scheme's greatest resource and its fundamental weakness. They rode back to Iron Creek with the wind picking up from the northwest, carrying in it the particular sharp smell that Wade Hollis had told her in one of his rare extended statements was the smell of a real storm building somewhere up in the high country. "That went better than expected," Silas said. "He's a good man," Adeline said. "He made a bad choice and didn't know it was a bad choice. That's different from being the same kind of person as Crowell." "Most people are that," Silas said, "making choices they don't fully see." She looked at him sideways on the trail. He said things like that sometimes, simple sentences that opened into more than they appeared to contain, and then moved past them without elaboration, as if he'd just commented on the weather. She was beginning to understand that this was not bluntness, but its opposite, a man who felt things deeply and had long ago decided that the frontier was not a place that had much patience for that, and had compressed it all into the minimum possible surface area. "Silas," she said. He looked at her. "You're allowed to be relieved," she said. "When this is done, you're allowed to feel like things might actually be all right." He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved in his face that he let be there for about 3 seconds before he looked back at the trail. "Ask me again when it's done," he said. It wasn't done. 3 days later, a ranch hand from Prescott's neighboring operation came riding hard into Iron Creek Yard with a message, and a face that said the message was bad. The message was from Prescott himself, who had heard from a hand who'd been at the saloon the previous night. Crowell knew. He didn't know how much. He didn't know about Harold Bell or the documents, But he knew that Silas Rourke had been talking to Orson Vale, and he had gone to Vale that morning, and Vale had told him enough to make him dangerous. Vale talked, Silas said. Partly, Adeline said. She was reading the message again. But listen, he didn't tell Crowell about the survey or the documents. He told him that Silas had been asking questions about the water rights value. She looked up. Crowell's angry, but he's not running. If he knew about the Bell documents, he'd be moving legally to discredit them, not sending messages through the saloon. He's going to do something, Bram said. He was standing at the edge of the conversation with his hat in his hands, which she'd noticed he did when something worried him enough to make him forget his usual careful distance. Man like Crowell, when he knows he's being pushed, he doesn't wait. No, she agreed. He doesn't. What they didn't know, couldn't have known yet, was what kind of something Crowell had in mind. He had people in the valley. He had leverage on some of them. He had patience, which was his best quality and his most dangerous one. The something arrived the same way everything in this valley arrived, through weather. The storm that Wade Hollis had smelled 3 days earlier hit the mountain passes on a Thursday night with the kind of violence that reminded everyone in the valley exactly how small their arrangements were in the context of Montana in October. Adeline lay awake listening to it shake the house and thought about the account books, the supply schedules, the livestock positions across the property. At 3 a.m, she sat up in bed with a specific thought fully formed: the high pasture. 32 cattle still in the upper grazing land, which they had planned to bring down the following week. She'd seen it in the schedule she'd written out Tuesday. The trail down from the high pasture crossed Iron Creek twice, and Iron Creek was... She thought about the last 3 days of rain, the saturated ground, the temperature that had been dropping since midday. She was dressed and in the hallway before she'd fully decided to be. Silas's door opened before she reached it. He was already up, in his work clothes, and when he saw her he said, "The high pasture." 32 head, she said. "I know. I've been lying there thinking about it for an hour." He moved past her toward the stairs. "I should have brought them down last week. The schedule said next week. The storm wasn't said next week. The storm wasn't supposed to... I know what the schedule said." She let that go. He was right, and he knew it, and the knowing was doing its work on him already. They woke Bram and Wade. Bram's assessment was immediate and grim. If the creek was flooding at the lower crossing, the upper crossing was going to be impassable by mid-morning. They had maybe 4 hours to get the herd down before the trail became too dangerous to attempt. "All right," Silas said. "We all ride," Bram said. He said it looking at Silas, but he didn't say only us, which was a different thing. He looked briefly at Adeline and looked away, which was the closest thing to an invitation she was going to receive. She went to saddle her horse. "Adeline," Silas's voice behind her. She turned. He looked at her for a moment in the lamp-lit barn, the storm outside making the walls vibrate slightly. He had the expression of a man who has 2 competing thoughts and is trying to decide which one to say. She watched him resolve it. "Stay close," he said. "The upper trail is bad in wet weather." "I know," she said. "You've ridden it twice." "I remember it both times." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned and saddled his own horse. The trail up to the high pasture was worse than bad. It was the kind of riding that requires constant attention and no pride, picking the line carefully, trusting the horse's feet more than your own judgment, accepting that slow was the only speed that was actually getting you there. The gray mare with the white foot was, unexpectedly, the best horse on the mountain that morning. She had a quality Adeline had noticed before. She hated rushing, hated shortcuts, set her feet with a deliberateness that looked slow until you watched everyone else's horse scrambling and realized what deliberateness actually bought you. They reached the high pasture in just over an hour. The cattle were bunched at the far end, tight together the way herd animals get when something has been frightening them, and the reason was immediately visible. The northeast corner of the pasture fence had come down in the storm, and 3 head had already drifted through the gap into the timber before the rest of the herd's instinct to stay together had overcome the panic. 3 gone, Wade said. "Get the fence gap closed first," Bram said, "or we lose more while we're working." They worked. All of them. Silas and Bram on the fence with wire from the saddlebags, Wade and Eli moving the herd back from the gap, Adeline doing something she'd learned from watching Wade 3 weeks ago, which was working the edges of the cattle's vision to redirect their movement without triggering a full panic. It was less about force and more about pressure, understanding that the animal was going to go where it felt less uncomfortable, and placing yourself in the space that made the wrong direction more uncomfortable than the right one. It took 40 minutes to close the fence and get the herd settled. Then Bram went to look at the trail back down. He came back with a face that had closed off in a particular way. "The lower crossing," he said. "It's gone." "Gone," Silas repeated. "Creek's up 6 feet from last night, maybe more. The crossing stones are underwater. The current—" He shook his head. "A man on a good horse might make it. I would not put 32 cattle in that water." Silas looked at the trail, at the sky, which was low and dark and not finished with what it had to say. Then at the cattle, who were calming now but still tight, still nervous, the way animals are when they know something is still wrong. "The upper crossing," Wade said. "Quarter-mile further up," Bram said. "Better approach angle. But we'd need to push through the timber on the north side to get there, and in this weather—" "It's the only option," Silas said. They began moving the herd. Getting 32 head of cattle through a quarter-mile of Montana timber in a storm was not a thing that went smoothly. It was loud and slow and involved a significant amount of repositioning every few minutes as the trees created pressure points where the herd wanted to split. Adeline worked the left flank, which meant navigating the mare through timber gaps that were sometimes barely wider than her shoulders, and doing it fast enough to stay ahead of the cattle's drift and slow enough not to spook them into splitting further. She was so focused on the work that she didn't see what happened to Silas until she heard the sound. It wasn't a dramatic sound. It was the specific flat crack of a horse losing its footing on wet rock, followed by a splash, followed by a very short silence that felt much longer than it was. She came through the tree line to the upper crossing in time to see Silas's horse scrambling back onto the bank from the edge of the current, and Silas, she couldn't see him, and for a 3-second period that she would not think about for a long time afterward, she could not see him. Then Wade was in the water, which was thigh-deep even at the shallower upper crossing, grabbing Silas's arm, and Silas came up against the bank with his leg at a wrong angle and his face white in a way that was not cold and not fear, but pain. "Silas?" She was off her horse before she'd decided to be. "Silas, what—" "I'm fine," he said, which was clearly not true. The horse is fine." Eli had the horse. "You're not. Let me—" "It's my leg." He said it through his teeth, which meant he was controlling something significant. "I think it's— when the horse went down, He stopped. "It's not broken. I don't think it's broken, but I can't—" He tried to stand and his face went a shade whiter. "Don't," she said. "Adeline. The cattle." She looked up. The herd had stopped at the tree line, 32 head of nervous cattle watching the creek the way animals watch something that has already hurt one of their number and might hurt them next. The water was brown and fast, and had risen further even in the 40 minutes they'd been working the timber. The storm was still coming, and Silas, who was the most experienced person on this mountain, was sitting against a creek bank unable to stand. Bram looked at her. Wade looked at her. Eli looked at her. The cattle were not moving. She looked at the herd, at the creek, at the opposite bank, which was about 40 feet of fast brown water away. She thought about what she knew. She had watched Wade and Bram work cattle for 11 weeks. She had watched the way they used pressure and position, the geometry of it, the understanding of how an animal's attention works. She had ridden this herd enough times to know their individual characters, which ones led and which ones followed, and which ones stood in the middle, being usefully influenced by both. She walked back along the herd's edge. Near the back, where she expected them, were the older cow and her calf. The calf was perhaps 4 months old, young enough to be frightened of everything, old enough to move on its own. The cow was tracking the calf constantly, the automatic, exhausting vigilance of a mother who has learned that the world is specifically organized to separate her from the things she can't afford to lose. Adeline had thought about this pairing before. She'd watched them in the pasture in quieter moments. She knew something about that particular vigilance from a different angle, from the years she'd spent beside her own mother's bed, managing the household around the fact of someone else's fragility. You learn things in those years about what attention looks like when it's not a choice but a fact of how you're built. She positioned the mare to the left of the calf, gently, deliberately. She moved the mare forward just enough, not rushing, not threatening, just present on the left side. The calf had nowhere comfortable to go but right, toward the water. The calf did not want to enter the water. She kept the pressure even, patient. Just, here I am, here is the space, the most comfortable thing available to you is forward. The calf stepped into the current. For a moment it was simply terrifying. A young animal in fast water, fighting the current, its legs churning. Then it got its feet under the riverbed and began crossing, unsteady, lurching, but moving. And the cow entered the water behind it. She didn't hesitate. She went in like something inevitable, because there was no version of this equation in which she stayed on the bank while her calf was in the current. She fought through the flood with a ferocity that had nothing measured or calculated about it, all instinct and muscle, and she came up on the other bank shaking water from her face and immediately turned back to watch the calf come out of the water beside her. They were across. The herd stood at the bank and watched. And then the lead steer, a big roan that Adeline had learned was the de facto decision-maker of the group, took 3 steps forward and put his front feet in the water and stopped and then went in. One by one, they crossed. It took 23 minutes. It was not clean. 2 of the younger cattle had to be encouraged back on course by Eli on the south side and Bram on the north. But they crossed, all 32. One after another, finding their footing in the brown current, fighting through it, coming up on the opposite bank with wet sides and wide eyes, and the herd instinct immediately pulling them back together once they were through. Adeline crossed last, with the mare, and helped Wade get Silas across on his horse. Silas, who had managed to remount through what must have been impressive pain, because it was a pain he could manage, and 32 cattle in a flooding creek was not a situation he was going to experience sitting against a bank. He was gray by the time they reached the opposite bank. "You need to stop," Adeline said. "I need to get the cattle down the mountain," he said. "Bram and Wade will get the cattle down the mountain." She moved her horse alongside his so she could watch his face. "Your leg needs to be looked at." "It's fine." "Silas, it is not fine, and you know it." He looked at her with an expression that had pain in it and stubbornness in it, and underneath both of those, something that was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the morning's work. "I'm all right," he said. "You're not." She kept her voice even. "But you're going to be. So let Bram take the herd down, and you're going to come down with me, and we're going to get you home before that leg decides to become something worse than it is." He stared at her for a long moment. Then the storm, which had been building its argument quietly for the past hour, finally made its point. A crack of cold, driving rain came down the mountain like a wall moving sideways, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in under a minute, and the trail below them disappeared into gray. "All right," Silas said, "just that. Quiet, tired, real." They came down the mountain together in the storm, slow and careful, Adeline slightly ahead of Silas, because the mare was the surest-footed animal on that trail, and she needed to find the line first. She could hear him behind her, his breathing, the occasional controlled sound when the horse's movement jarred his leg, and she tracked it the way she had tracked her mother's breathing on bad nights, with the part of her attention that didn't need to be conscious about it. They reached Iron Creek Yard in the early afternoon. Mara was on the porch with an expression that had been waiting for them. Not panicked, not a child's expression at all, but the contained, watchful face of a girl who had learned that people you love go out in bad weather and sometimes don't come back, and who had been holding that knowledge quietly since they left at 4 in the morning. When she saw her father's face and the way he was holding himself in the saddle, she went very still. "He hurt his leg," Adeline said before Mara could ask or not ask. "He's all right, but he needs to come inside." Mara came down the porch steps immediately and went to her father's horse and put her hand on the bridle, which was both unnecessary, the horse was calm, and completely necessary in every other way. "I've got you, Papa," she said. Silas looked down at his daughter. Something moved across his face that the pain and the storm couldn't get to. "I know you do," he said. They got him inside. Adeline sent Eli for the doctor from Coldwater Ridge, which was a 40-minute ride each direction in good weather and not good weather today. She examined the leg herself. She had no medical training, but she had common sense and steady hands, and she'd read the chapter on injuries in the ranch first aid manual that lived in the drawer under the kitchen counter, which she had read with the same thoroughness she'd applied to the account books, and concluded that it was badly bruised and possibly involved a strained ligament, but was almost certainly not broken. She told Silas this. He looked at her with eyes that were starting to have the unfocused quality of serious pain having been managed through will for too long. "You read the manual," he said. "I read everything in this house," she said. "Now hold still." She wrapped the leg. It was not a perfect job, but it was a competent one. And when the doctor arrived 2 hours later and examined it, he confirmed her assessment, badly strained, possibly a small fracture that he couldn't be certain about without better equipment, bed rest for at minimum 2 weeks and no riding for 4. Silas argued with him. Adeline listened to him argue from the doorway and thought about the next 3 weeks and the November 1st deadline, and Crowell, who now knew something was moving against him, and the documents in the kitchen drawer, and the 32 cattle who were all down the mountain alive, and she thought, we don't have 2 weeks. But they had to find a way to have it anyway. Toby had been underfoot since they got home, orbiting his father's room, with the particular 6-year-old energy of someone who is very worried and is expressing it through constant motion and periodic questions. When Adeline finally got Silas settled and the doctor out and came downstairs, she found Toby standing in the kitchen looking at the window where the storm was still pressing itself against the glass. "Is Papa going to be all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "You're sure?" "Toby, your father survived 11 years of working this ranch alone. He's going to survive a bad leg." Toby considered this. Then he looked at her sideways. "You got the cattle down. We all did. But you figured it out, with the cow and the baby." He'd been in the barn when they brought the herd in and had heard the story from Eli in the compressed, slightly embellished way that stories travel through ranch hands, who are fundamentally storytellers. "You used the mama cow's feelings to make her go." "Her instincts," Adeline said. "But it's the same thing, isn't it?" Toby said. "Feelings and instincts. When something matters enough, you just do it." She looked at him. He was 6 years old, and he said things like that, things that landed in the middle of more adult conversations than he knew. "Yes," she said. "That's more or less exactly right." He seemed satisfied with this. He climbed up onto the kitchen chair and reached for the bread on the table. Then he said, casually, in the way children say the things that matter most, "I'm glad you were there." She stood at the kitchen counter and held that sentence for a moment. Outside, the storm was starting to ease off, the rain thinning from a roar to a murmur. In the barn, she knew Bram and Wade were settling the cattle and doing the equipment check that always followed a hard day on the mountain. Somewhere up the road, Crowell was sitting in his house knowing that something had shifted against him and trying to calculate how to respond. And in the room upstairs, Silas Rourke, who had spent a year trying to carry everything alone, was lying flat with an injured leg and no choice but to let someone else carry some of it for a while. She thought about what Toby had said. When something matters enough, you just do it. She put a pot of water on the stove for soup because it was late afternoon and cold, and the ranch hands would need to eat when they came in, and there was nothing more fundamental to keeping a place running than making sure the people who ran it had something warm to come into. She had learned this from her mother, from the garment trade, from 11 weeks on this ranch, that the invisible work of feeding people and steadying a household was not smaller than the visible work of riding fences and moving cattle. It was just easier to overlook. She was not going to be overlooked anymore. The thought arrived without drama or particular anger. Just a fact, sitting quietly inside her like the warm weight of the stove beginning to heat the kitchen. She had come to Montana as a stranger, a mail-order bride, a woman the valley had already categorized and discounted. She had spent 11 weeks making herself useful in every way she could find, and the valley had still looked at her with that particular 55-degree temperature. Not cold, not warm. After today, after Crowell's scheme beginning to crack at its edges, and the cattle coming down the mountain and Silas's leg, and the documents in the drawer, and Lenora and Harold and Danner all moving in the direction of something that might actually hold, after today, the valley was going to have to make a different calculation. Mara came downstairs while the soup was simmering. She moved through the kitchen with her usual careful economy and set the table without being asked, which she always did because Mara Rourke understood responsibility in the same instinctive way she breathed. She set 4 places, started to set a 5th, her father's, and then stood there with the bowl in her hand. Adeline watched her from the stove. Mara set the bowl in the center of the table, where it could be taken up to Silas later. Then she looked at Adeline with her father's eyes, that careful, assessing, not quite open look. "You're good at this," Mara said. Not warmly, not coldly, just as a statement of something she had observed and decided to report. "At what?" Adeline said. "All of it." Mara looked at the window. "Knowing what to do." "I don't always know what to do," Adeline said. "I knew what to try. There's a difference." Mara considered this. She had the quality, like her father, of actually considering things rather than just appearing to. "The cattle are all down," Mara said. "I counted when Bram brought them in." "All 32. Mara nodded, set another bowl down. Then, still not looking at Adeline, still using that sideways address that seemed to be how she said the things that cost her something, "I'm glad they're safe." It was not a declaration. It was not a breakthrough. It was a girl with her father's eyes, standing at a table she set every night, choosing to say a thing out loud that she might otherwise have kept. Adeline turned back to the soup. "Me too," she said. The storm finished its business with Montana around 7 o'clock that evening and left behind a sky that was clean and very cold and full of more stars than Adeline had been able to see in Cincinnati in 20 years of looking up. She stood on the porch after supper and looked at them and thought about all the pieces that were now in motion. Harold Bell's documents, Danner's testimony, Orson Vale's reassessment, the Garrett survey, November 1st 3 weeks away, and Crowell knowing something was wrong but not yet knowing how wrong. It was not finished. It was not even close to finished. But she thought about Bram Kessler, who had come to find her first this morning about the water trough, and Wade Hollis, who had pulled Silas from the creek and then looked to her for the next call, and Toby's voice saying, "I'm glad you were there," and Mara's careful sideways statement about 32 cattle coming home safe. She thought about Silas, upstairs, who had said, "Ask me again when it's done," when she told him he was allowed to feel like things might be all right. She looked at the stars over Montana, which did not care about any of this and were beautiful anyway. She went back inside. There was work to do in the morning, and she intended to be ready for it. The doctor had said 2 weeks of bed rest, minimum. Silas lasted 4 days. On the 5th morning, Adeline came downstairs to find him already at the kitchen table with the account books open and a cup of coffee that was still steaming, which meant he'd been up long enough to make it, but not long enough to drink it, which meant he'd come down before full light, which meant he hadn't slept well, which she could have told anyone who asked because she'd heard him moving around upstairs at 2 in the morning and again at 4. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who has already prepared his defense. "I'm not riding," he said. "You're not supposed to be on the stairs." "The stairs are fine. Silas, Adeline." He said it the way he said things when he'd made a decision and was not particularly interested in revisiting it. "I cannot lie in that room while everything is happening. I will go out of my mind." He paused. "I'll stay off the leg. I'll sit here. But I need to know what's going on." She looked at him for a moment. Then she went and got her own coffee and sat across from him, because that was the only reasonable response to a man who was going to do what he was going to do regardless. "Bram moved the east cattle to the lower pasture yesterday," she said. "The north fence is fully repaired. Wade thinks the storm damage to the hay barn roof is manageable if we get to it before the next weather system, which Eli says is 10 days out, possibly 12. The roof will need timber." "I know. I was going to send to Danner's operation this morning." She paused deliberately. "Given recent developments, I thought he might be willing to extend credit on the delivery." Silas absorbed this. That's practical. It's also a way of keeping communication open with him before the county investigation starts formally moving. She wrapped both hands around her cup. He needs to feel like he's part of what's coming, not just a witness to it. People cooperate better when they have a stake in the outcome. Silas looked at her over his coffee. "You've been thinking about this since before you came downstairs." "I've been thinking about it since 3 in the morning, she said honestly. Something almost like a smile. "How much sleep did you get?" "Enough." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have." She stood up. "Eat something. I'm going to send the message to Danner, and then I need to talk to you about the November 1st timeline, because I think we have a problem." The problem was this. With Silas off his leg and the storm damage requiring immediate attention, and the ranch hands stretched thin across both emergency repair and regular operations, Someone needed to make the decisions that kept Iron Creek functioning. That someone was Adeline. This was not the problem. The problem was that Crowell knew they were building a case against him, and Crowell was not the kind of man who waited for someone else to finish building before he moved. She had seen his patience in the 6-year scheme, in the methodical pressure campaign against Iron Creek, in the way he had structured his arrangements with Vale and Danner and Bell as interlocking dependencies so that moving against him felt like moving against the entire valley. But patience was a strategy, not a personality. When patience stopped serving him, he would switch to something else. She explained this to Silas at the kitchen table while he ate the breakfast she'd made without asking if he wanted it. Eggs and bread, and a piece of the cured ham from the cellar. Because she'd noticed that when he was in pain, he didn't eat unless the food was already in front of him. He's going to try to discredit the survey, she said. Or the Bell documents, or both. He has enough money to hire someone to challenge the Garrett findings, and enough influence to slow a county investigation for months if he gets to the right people first. So we need to move before he moves, Silas said. We need to file formally before he has time to build a counter-response. She set her own cup down. Harold Bell is willing to submit his statement voluntarily. Danner can testify about his arrangement with Crowell. The Garrett survey is independent and certified. If all three go to the county investigator at the same time, as a single coordinated submission, he can't discredit all three simultaneously without it looking like what it is, Silas said. Yes, but we need it to happen in the next week, maybe less. Silas was quiet. Then, can you coordinate that? She met his eyes. Yes. He held her gaze. Something moved through his expression that wasn't the assessing look anymore. It had gone past that, into something more direct, something he wasn't entirely comfortable with, and wasn't hiding that discomfort particularly well. All right, he said. The next 5 days were the most complicated of Adeline's life, and her life had included some genuinely complicated days. She was managing the ranch's daily operations, which alone would have been a full day's work for a person with more experience. She was coordinating the simultaneous legal submissions from 3 separate individuals, Harold Bell, Caleb Danner, and Orson Vale, who had quietly come around after his second reading of the Garrett survey and a private conversation with his own land attorney in Billings, to the county investigator's office in Hardenburg, which was 60 miles east and required a specific filing format that Harold Bell knew and taught her over 2 mornings at the Bell House while Lenora made coffee and said very little and tracked everything. She was also managing Silas, which was its own category of complicated. He was a difficult patient not because he was demanding, but because he was a man who had run his own operation through a Montana winter alone and had a deep constitutional unease with watching other people carry his weight. He sat at the kitchen table for most of the day and ran calculations and made lists and asked questions about everything with the careful precision of a man who is trying to stay useful when the machinery he normally operates has been temporarily removed from his hands. Adeline answered his questions, incorporated his knowledge where it was better than hers, which was frequently because he had 20 years on this land and she had 11 weeks, and otherwise kept him fed and informed and out of the cold. Mara helped with this last part more than Adeline would have predicted. The girl had developed a system, quiet and unremarked, of appearing in the kitchen near her father's chair at intervals, not hovering, not performing concern, just being present in the careful way that told Adeline she was watching to make sure he stayed where he was supposed to be. Once, when Adeline came in from outside to find Silas halfway to his coat, with the obvious intention of just checking the south fence situation, Mara was already standing in the doorway to the hallway, with her arms crossed, and an expression that was her father's assessing look turned on its creator. "Papa," she said. He stopped. "Bram already checked it," she said. A silence. "Mara, Bram, already checked it." She did not move from the doorway. Silas looked at Adeline, who was doing her absolute best to have no expression whatsoever. He took off his coat. Later, when Mara had gone upstairs, Silas said, "She gets that from her mother." "What, being right?" He looked at her. "I meant the ability to communicate a complete argument in 2 words," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Her mother could do that. Say something with almost no words and you'd know exactly what she meant. He looked at his hands. "Mara was 8 when she died. She barely talks about her." "I know," Adeline said carefully. "She talks to you sometimes." He said it without accusation, more like he was noting something he was still working out how to feel about. I hear them. In the kitchen sometimes, or upstairs. She says more to you in an hour than she says to me in a week. She said maybe 40 words to me directly, Adeline said. But she's around. She's there when I'm doing things. She watches. She paused. I think she's testing to see if I stay. Silas looked up. Not consciously, Adeline said. But losing her mother the way she did, suddenly, with no warning, I think she's learned to wait and see whether people are actually going to be there before she stopped. Before she invests. The kitchen was quiet. Smart, Silas said. And then, very quietly, looking at the table. I haven't been as present as I should have been after her mother died. I was trying to keep the ranch alive and He stopped. She needed more than I had to give. You kept her fed and safe and home, Adeline said. That's not nothing. It's not enough. She didn't argue with that because she suspected he was right, but she also didn't agree with the weight he was putting on it. You're here now, she said. You're at the kitchen table every day. That's not nothing either. He looked at her for a long moment. You're easier to talk to than I expected, he said. It came out with the slightly surprised quality of someone who has just noticed a thing and isn't sure whether to say it, but has said it anyway. I'll try not to take offense at that, she said. I didn't mean... He stopped, almost smiled. I meant it as a compliment. I know, she said. I was joking. He looked at her. You joke. Occasionally, when the situation warrants it. The almost smile became an actual one. Brief, careful, a thing that appeared and then retreated, but real. It was the first time she'd seen it completely, and it changed his face in a way she hadn't anticipated. Took a decade off it, uncovered something younger and less armored that the years had been covering up. She looked back at the account she'd been working on. She told herself that the warmth in her chest was the kitchen stove. The coordinated submission reached the county investigator's office on a Thursday, 11 days after the storm. Adeline had ridden to Hardenburg personally because she didn't trust the material to a courier and because there were questions the investigator was going to have that needed to be answered by someone who understood the full scope of what was being alleged. The county investigator was a methodical woman named Eudora Marsh, no relation to the Marsh family whose land Crowell had already acquired, a coincidence that Adeline noted, who read the submission with the focused attention of someone who has learned that the quality of documents varies enormously and has trained herself to assess it quickly. She read for 40 minutes, then she asked 40 minutes of questions, then she went back and read one section again. These certified values, she said, from the Bell filings. Yes. They were submitted to the state land office as accurate. Yes. And you have a certified independent survey showing the actual values. The Garrett survey, conducted 6 weeks ago and certified through the state surveyor's office in Helena. Eudora Marsh looked at the documents for another long moment. Mrs. Rourke, she said, how long have you been in Montana? 12 weeks, Adeline said. The investigator looked up, studied her with the assessing expression of a woman who has spent years in county government developing an extremely accurate read on who is telling her something real and who is trying to manage her. This is a comprehensive filing, she said. I had help, Adeline said. Significant help. From people in this valley who understood what was happening and were willing to stand behind it. The Bell statement is voluntary? Completely. Harold Bell retained his own attorney before submitting. And Danner's testimony? Also voluntary. Caleb Danner has been in Crowell's confidence for 22 years. He wants to make his own position clear before the investigation proceeds. Eudora Marsh set the documents down. I need to tell you something, Mrs. Rourke, that I would tell anyone filing against Thaddeus Crowell. She folded her hands. Crowell has resources. He has a land attorney in Billings who is very good at finding procedural grounds to delay investigations. He has relationships at the state level that can complicate the timeline significantly. And he has, in my direct experience, a capacity for patience that most people underestimate. I know, Adeline said. This may take months, even with everything you've brought me today. I understand. Your November 1st deadline, the deadline is Crowell's, Adeline said, not ours. If the investigation is formally open before November 1st, he loses his legal standing to escalate the pressure campaign against Iron Creek Ranch. He can't legally move against a property that's a party to an active county investigation. A pause. You've spoken to an attorney, Eudora Marsh said. Silas's wife, his first wife, kept a correspondence with an attorney in Helena regarding the water rights. I found the letters in the household files. His name is Jeffrey Stanmore. I wrote to him 3 weeks ago. Another pause, longer. All right, Eudora Marsh said. She picked up the documents. I'll begin formally today. Adeline rode home in early evening with the sky turning the particular colors it turned in Montana in late October, the kind of sunset that cities never quite managed because there wasn't enough sky in them. She was tired in a way that went through her bones and settled somewhere fundamental. Not the tired that comes from not sleeping, though she hadn't slept much. The tired that comes from operating at full intensity for weeks without a safe place to set any of it down. She let herself have the tiredness on the ride home. The mare didn't need managing on the familiar road. The evening was cold and still. She let herself sit with the weight of the past 12 days without trying to calculate the next thing. She thought about Harold Bell's face when he'd handed over the documents, about Danner saying 22 years to a window, about Lenora Bell's composed expression cracking into something genuine and exhausted when Adeline had come to tell her the submission was complete, about Orson Vale, who had sent a formal letter to Silas, terse, barely apologetic, but substantive, outlining his intention to cooperate with the investigation. She thought about Silas at the kitchen table with the account books, doing calculations he trusted her to act on. She thought about Mara in the doorway with her arms crossed, about Toby saying when something matters enough, you just do it. She came into Iron Creek Yard as the last of the light was going, and Silas was on the porch. He was supposed to be inside. She looked at him from the yard with an expression that communicated this clearly. I've been on this leg all day, he said. I just stood up 20 minutes ago. The doctor said no riding. I'm not riding. I'm standing on my own porch. She tied the mare, came up the steps. He was watching her face with that direct, unguarded look that appeared when his defenses were down, which they were when he was in pain and tired and had spent a day unable to do the things he needed to do. Did she file? He said. She filed today. The investigation is formally open. She stopped in front of him. He can't move legally against Iron Creek while we're a party to an active county case. Silas's face. She watched the weight of the past 3 months shift on it. Not disappear, not resolve into simple relief, but shift. Rearrange. Like something that has been held at a particular angle for so long that when you finally set it down, your arms don't quite know what to do. It's not over, he said. No, it'll be months. He'll fight it. But we have time now. We have time now, she said. He looked at her. The evening was cold around them, and the porch light was throwing shadows across his face, and he was looking at her the way he had a few times before, the unguarded version, but this time he didn't look away. I don't know how to thank you, he said. You don't have to thank me. This is my ranch too. Adeline. He said her name with a weight that was different from how he usually said it. You came here 3 months ago with a battered trunk, and you didn't know anyone, and you didn't know this land, and every single person in this valley was waiting for you to give up. He paused. Including me. Not openly. But I wasn't sure you'd stay, she said. Be what this needed, he said. I wasn't sure you'd be what this needed. And now? He looked at her for a long moment. Now, I don't know what we would have done without you. She felt that land. Let it be real rather than deflecting it. We, she said. Yes. You said we. He looked slightly thrown. Is that? No, it's... She stopped. That's the first time you've said it that way. He was quiet. Then, has it been that bad? That I was... You were managing, she said. You were being careful. That's not the same as bad. She looked at the dark yard, the dark mountains behind it. We were both being careful. Were, he said. Past tense, intentional. She looked back at him. The door opened behind him and Toby appeared in it, apparently having reached the limit of his ability to wait for supper, and the moment, which had been building into something neither of them were quite ready for, dissolved into the ordinary, which was its own kind of relief. Are you two going to stand out here all night? Toby said. Because I'm starving. You're always starving, Adeline said. That's because I'm growing. Mara said so. He held the door open with the expectant expression of someone who has done his part and is now waiting for the adults to catch up. Silas moved toward the door, and Adeline noticed with the part of her that was always noticing that he was moving better than he had 2 days ago. The leg still wrong, but not as wrong. The compensation less extreme. She followed them inside. That night, after supper, after Toby had been put to bed and Mara had retreated upstairs with her book, Adeline was cleaning up the kitchen when she heard a sound from the hallway and turned to find Mara standing there in her nightgown with a specific expression that meant she had come downstairs for a reason and was working out how to say it. "Can't sleep?" Adeline said. "I want to ask you something," Mara said. "All right." Mara came into the kitchen and sat at the table, not in her usual spot, but in Adeline's usual spot, which was either accidental or meaningful. She folded her hands on the table the way her father did and looked at them. "Did you know," she said, "when you first came here that Crowell was going to be a problem?" "No," Adeline said. "I didn't know anything about Crowell when I arrived." "When did you know?" "When he came to the ranch. When he dropped the paper." Adeline dried her hands on the dishcloth. "Before that, I just knew the valley was cautious about me." "They thought you were going to take the ranch and leave," Mara said. "Yes." "Were you?" Adeline looked at her. "No." "How did they know that? How did you know that?" "I didn't think about it that way," Adeline said carefully. "I thought about, I needed somewhere to be. I needed a life that was mine. This was the place I'd come to build it." She paused. "You don't usually think about running from the thing you came to build." Mara considered this. "My mother never thought about leaving either," she said. "She told me that once. She said she'd come to this valley when she was 23, and she'd known the first winter that it was going to be hard forever, but she'd decided it was hers, and that was that." A pause. "She died in spring. It was very fast. She was sick on Tuesday and gone by Saturday." The kitchen was quiet. "I know," Adeline said. "I know you know. Papa told you." Mara looked at her hands. "I was angry at her for a while, for leaving, which is stupid because she didn't choose—" "It's not stupid," Adeline said. "It doesn't make sense." "It doesn't have to make sense. You were 8, and someone who was supposed to always be there suddenly wasn't. The mind looks for someone to be angry at." She paused. "It's human." Mara looked up at her. "Were you angry when your mother died?" Adeline thought about sitting in a 2-room Cincinnati apartment with $34 and the silence that follows 6 years of caring for someone who is no longer there to care for. "Yes," she said. "For a little while." "At her?" "At everything," she said. "At the apartment, at the city, at the fact that I'd arranged my whole life around something that was going to end and hadn't made any arrangement for what happened after." "Is that why you answered the advertisement?" Adeline looked at this 10-year-old girl with her father's eyes and her mother's courage, and thought about how much of the true answer she was willing to offer. "Partly," she said. "Partly it was practical. I needed a future. But partly it was that I needed to stop being the person who was waiting for something and start being someone who was doing something." She met Mara's eyes. "Does that make sense?" Mara thought about it with that careful, genuine consideration that was entirely her own quality. "Yes," she said. Then, "I tried to make you leave." Adeline waited. "The first few weeks, I didn't do anything bad, I just—" Mara looked at the table. "I was unfriendly, more than I needed to be. I thought if you felt like nobody wanted you here, you'd go." "I noticed," Adeline said. Mara's face flickered. "Did Papa—" "Your father was managing a ranch and an injured leg and a land dispute. He wasn't watching how you said good morning." She paused. "But I noticed." Mara was quiet. "I'm not angry about it," Adeline said. "I understood it." "You did?" "You lost someone without warning. Of course you weren't going to immediately welcome a stranger into the place she left." Adeline sat down across from her. Not in her own usual spot, just in Silas's. That would have been strange, actually. It would have meant you hadn't loved her enough to miss her. Mara looked at her with an expression that had something cracked open in it. Not broken, not hurt, just open. The way a window goes when someone finally finds the stuck latch. "I did love her," Mara said. "I do." "I know," Adeline said. "Anyone who watches you for 5 minutes knows that." A long silence. I don't want you to leave, Mara said. She said it to the table, in the sideways fashion that was her mode for things that cost her. I know that's different from, I'm not saying, she stopped. I don't want you to leave. Adeline sat with that for a moment, with the weight of it, the gift of it. I'm not leaving, she said. Even when it's hard? Mara, do you know what kind of person answers a stranger's advertisement and moves to Montana alone in October? She waited until the girl looked up. Not the kind who leaves when things get hard. Mara almost smiled. Not quite. She had the same controlled almost smile as her father, but close. Okay, she said, like it was simple. Like she'd been waiting for someone to say a plain thing and mean it, and now that someone had, that was enough. She went back upstairs. Adeline sat at the kitchen table alone for a few minutes, not doing anything in particular, just sitting in the quiet of a house that was settling around her in the particular way houses settle when the people in them are finally sleeping without trouble. The next morning brought the first real frost of the season, which descended on Iron Creek with the efficient brutality that suggested winter had stopped being patient about its arrival. Adeline was up at 4:30 to make sure the water lines were clear and the livestock had what they needed before the temperature dropped further. She worked alongside Bram and Eli for 2 hours in the cold dark, and when the light came up and they came inside for coffee, Bram poured her cup before his own. He did it without saying anything, without making it a thing, just poured her cup first, the way you do for someone who had been working as long as you had. She drank her coffee and said nothing about it, and understood that this was, in the language of men like Bram Kessler, approximately as eloquent as a speech. The response from Crowell came 4 days later. It came through his attorney, a letter delivered to the county investigator's office, and copied to Harold Bell's attorney and to Jeffrey Stanmore in Helena, alleging procedural irregularities in the Garrett survey's certification and questioning the chain of custody for the Bell documents. The language was precise and deliberate and designed to create delay. Eudora Marsh sent Adeline a copy with a note that said, as expected, it will not hold, but it will take time. Adeline read it twice and then set it in the kitchen drawer beside the original Garrett survey and wrote back to Jeffrey Stanmore and Helena with the specific questions his counterargument would need to address. Because she had read his earlier letters carefully and understood both the strength of his approach and the one gap in it that Crowell's attorney had found. Silas read her letter to Stanmore that evening. You found a gap, he said. His attorney found it first. I just found it second. Can Stanmore close it? If he has the original certification timestamps from the Helena surveyor's office, yes. She looked at the letter. I asked him to check. Silas looked at her. She could feel him looking at her from across the table with that direct expression, the one that had stopped retreating. What? She said. Nothing, he said. I'm just... He stopped. You're remarkable, Adeline. She looked up from the letter. He said it the way he said things that he'd decided on. Not impulsively, not softly, just stated. A fact he'd assessed and concluded was accurate. I'm practical, she said. That too, he said. But that's not the same thing. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the letter. We'll see. The attorney has to close the gap first. He'll close it, Silas said, with the same certainty he used for weather assessments and livestock decisions, because you told him exactly what he needs. She finished the letter, sealed it, set it aside for the morning's post. Outside, the frost had settled fully over Iron Creek, whitening the yard and the fence posts and the mountain ridges in the distance. The cold was real now, not threatening, installed. This was winter beginning its long residence, the way it did in Montana, with a thoroughness that made it clear it intended to stay until it was ready to leave, and not a day sooner. 3 days after Crowell's legal response, Adeline got the news she hadn't been expecting. A second storm, smaller than the first but faster, had come through the western ridge on a Wednesday night and hit Caleb Danner's timber operation with a focused brutality that, as Wade Hollis put it when he came in with the report from town, seemed personal. A section of the long fence that separated Danner's winter grazing land from the open ridge had collapsed under ice weight and 3 hours of 30-mile-an-hour wind, and 2 of his fence crew had been working to address storm damage to the mill structure when the fence went. And by the time anyone had organized a response, Danner had lost significant sections of his northern boundary, and with it the means to keep his livestock from drifting into the open ridge before the full winter settled. She heard this standing in the general store in Coldwater Ridge, from Dottie Hatch, who had heard it from Prescott's wife, who had seen Danner's foreman riding fast through town at first light. She stood with a sack of flour in her arms and thought about Caleb Danner saying 22 years to his window, about the way he'd walked them to their horses after the meeting, brisk and resolved and already calculating what came next, about what it would mean for him to lose his winter boundary in the same month he'd publicly broken with the man who'd kept him organized and directed for 2 decades. She thought about the fact that everyone in the valley knew she had every reason to let Danner struggle. She went home and told Silas. He was at the kitchen table. He looked at her when she told him, looked at the table, looked back at her. He sided with Crowell, Silas said. He didn't know he was siding against us, she said. He thought he was managing his relationship with a powerful neighbor. Same thing most people in this valley have been doing for 15 years. Adeline, his fence is down, she said. It's going to be full winter in 10 days. If his livestock drift before he can rebuild, he loses the grazing season. He might lose the operation. She set the flour on the counter. I'm going to take a wagon. Silas stared at her. I'm going to take timber from the supply we have stockpiled for the hay barn repair, and I'm going to take Wade and Eli and whoever else Bram can spare, and we're going to go help Caleb Danner fix his fence. She turned to face Silas fully. Because it's the right thing to do, and because this valley has been organized around Crowell's power for 15 years, and the only way to reorganize it is to show people what the alternative looks like. Silas was quiet for a long moment. You can't spare the timber, he said. We need it for the hay barn. We have enough for both if we're careful about the cuts. She had already calculated this. Danner's mill can supply replacement stock once his operation is stable. He'll do it. I know he will. You're certain? About Danner? Yes. Silas looked at her. The kitchen was warm and quiet, and outside the frost was on everything, and the hay barn roof needed attention, and the county investigation was grinding through its early procedural battles, and all of that was true. And also this was true. A man who had unintentionally helped cause harm was in trouble, and the question of what to do about that was simpler than Crowell wanted the valley to believe. Take Bram too, Silas said. He knows fence work better than Wade. I know, she said. I was going to ask him. And take this good wire, not the leftover from the north repair. Danner's Ridge gets worse wind than our north line. She looked at him. What? He said. You just told me to take the good wire for our neighbor's fence. It's practical, he said. Use inferior wire and you're back there in February. He held her gaze. Also, it's the right thing. As you said. She almost smiled. As I said. He almost smiled back. Go. She went. Danner met the wagon at the entrance to his property with an expression she couldn't immediately read, wariness, and something else that was working to get underneath the wariness. He'd known they were coming because Wade had ridden ahead, but knowing a thing and seeing it were different, and seeing Adeline Rourke on the seat of a wagon loaded with timber and wire and 4 Iron Creek hands was apparently something that required a moment to absorb. Mrs. Rourke, he said, Mr. Danner, show me where the fence went. He walked them to the damaged section, which was worse than she'd been told. Not dramatically worse, but the kind of worse that matters, where the ground conditions had complicated the collapse and made a simple fence repair into something requiring more post-work than the wire alone would address. She looked at it and thought, and asked Danner 2 specific questions about his soil depth at the north posts, because that was going to determine the anchor strategy. He answered both questions, and then stopped and looked at her. You don't have to do this, he said. I know, she said. I wasn't friendly to you. When you came here, I said things in town about the ranch and about Rourke's judgment. He said it directly, without dressing it up. Things that made your situation harder. I know that too, she said. He looked at the fence, at the crew already pulling supplies from the wagon. Why did you come? She thought about the long answer, which involved valley power structures and strategic alliance building and the specific tactical calculus of how to reorganize a community that has been held in place by fear. She thought about this medium answer, which involved Silas saying, take the good wire, with the same voice he used for sound livestock decisions. She gave him the short answer, because it was also the true one. Because your fence is down and winter is coming, she said. And that's reason enough. He was quiet for a moment. Crowell's attorney filed against the investigation yesterday, he said. I know. It's going to be a fight. Yes. I'll be there for it, he said. Not loudly, just as a fact. I know, she said. Now come show Bram where the anchor posts need to go, because he's about to put them in the wrong place and he won't take my word for it. Danner looked at where Bram was setting up and assessed the situation. He's about to put them in the wrong place, he said. I told you. Something crossed his face that was adjacent to a smile. He went to redirect Bram. They worked until the light failed. It was cold, hard, manual work. Digging, setting, stretching wire. The kind of labor that leaves your hands stiff and your back reporting detailed information about itself. Danner worked alongside Iron Creek hands without hierarchy or awkwardness, just the shared language of people who understand that fence doesn't build itself and standing around talking about it doesn't speed the process. By the time they stopped for the day, the critical northern section was rebuilt. Not finished, a full day more would be needed, but standing, solid, the wire taut, and the posts set correctly. Danner stood at the finished section in the last light and put his hand on one of the new posts and just stood there for a moment. Then he turned to Adeline. Tell your husband, he said, that I'm going to remember this. Tell him yourself, she said. Come to supper Sunday. He's still off his leg, but he'd like to see you. Danner looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, once, the way men in this valley nodded when they meant something they didn't have the words for. They drove back to Iron Creek in the dark, the wagon empty of timber and wire, the hands tired and quiet in the way people get after a day of useful work. The stars were out, those enormous, indifferent Montana stars that had nothing to say about any of it, and said it beautifully. Adeline held the reins with her cold hands and looked at the road and let herself feel, for a moment, what had happened today. Not the tactical implications, not the next move, just the fact of it, a wagon full of people who had come to help because she had asked them, and a fence rebuilt because winter was coming, and that was reason enough. The valley was not Crowell's anymore. It hadn't been for a while maybe, but today it had demonstrated that openly, in the plain physical language of timber and wire, and cold hands working alongside each other. Iron Creek came into view around a bend in the road, the windows lit from inside, the porch light on. Silas had left the porch light on. She had not told him to. He had thought of it himself, or Mara had, or Toby. It didn't matter which. Someone in that house had thought, she'll be coming home in the dark, and left a light. She pulled the wagon into the yard. Inside, something warm was on the stove. She unhitched the horses and put them up and went inside, and the house took her in with the specific quality it had been developing for weeks now, the thing she hadn't been able to name until recently. It felt like hers. Not just Silas's, not the children's, not the practical arrangement she'd arrived to fulfill. Hers, the specific and irreplaceable feeling of a place that knows you and expects you back. Silas was at the table. How bad was it? He said. We got the north section standing, she said. One more full day and it'll hold through the winter. He looked at her cold reddened hands, her work-dirty coat, her face that had been in the wind all day. Come sit down, he said. Mara made soup. She came and sat down. Mara set a bowl in front of her without being asked. Toby immediately began describing, at length, something that had happened with the rooster that afternoon, and it was apparently very important and somewhat complicated and involved a misunderstanding about territory. Adeline ate her soup and listened to the story and felt the warmth of the kitchen work its way back into her hands. Outside, the Montana winter pressed itself against the windows and made its intentions clear. Inside, no one was particularly worried about it. Jeffrey Stanmore found the certification timestamps. He wrote to Adeline on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after she'd identified the gap in his argument, and the letter arrived with the particular density of something that contains more good news than its envelope suggests. The Helena Surveyor's Office had retained original filing records going back 14 years, and the timestamps on Crowell's submitted assessments predated the surveys they were supposedly based on by an average of 11 days. Not a procedural irregularity, not a clerical error. 11 days, consistently, across 7 separate filings, which meant the assessments had been prepared before the surveys were conducted, which meant the surveys had been conducted to match predetermined numbers rather than the other way around. It meant the fraud was not opportunistic, it was designed, Adeline read the letter twice at the kitchen table and then set it down very carefully, the way you set down something fragile, and sat with it for a moment. Silas was across from her. He watched her read and watched her set it down and waited. "He has the timestamps," she said. Silas was quiet for a moment, then, "All 7 filings?" "All 7. He looked at the table, at his hands. At the window where December had settled fully over the valley, the mountains white to their lower ridges now, the sky the particular gray of a Montana winter that has stopped being temporary. "It's enough," he said. "It's more than enough," she said. "Stanmore says the state land office will have to open their own investigation now. It's not just a county matter anymore." She paused. "Crowell is going to know this is coming before it formally arrives. He has people in Helena." "What does Stanmore recommend?" "He's already filed a motion to preserve all related documents at the county and state level. Nothing can be altered or withdrawn." She looked at the letter again. "He says Crowell's attorney will probably try to negotiate." "Negotiate," Silas said. "A quiet resolution. Crowell acknowledges the discrepancies, pays some form of restitution, avoids a public proceeding." She folded the letter. "Stanmore wants to know what we want." Silas looked at her directly. "What do we want?" She had been thinking about this since she'd sent the letter to Stanmore, about what winning actually looked like, and whether the version that felt satisfying in the abstract was the same version that would actually serve the valley in the long run. Crowell publicly destroyed, humiliated, his scheme exposed in full detail in a county proceeding that would be talked about for decades. That was one version. She understood the appeal of it. She also understood what it would do to Harold Bell, who had already lost enough sleep over his part in this, and to the neighboring ranchers who had followed Crowell not from malice, but from the ordinary human instinct to go along with power rather than challenge it. "Iron Creek keeps its water rights, fully documented and legally uncontestable," she said. "The fraudulent assessments are corrected in the state record. Every affected property owner, all 7, receives accurate documentation of their actual land values." She paused. "And Crowell withdraws from any claim to this valley's water access, permanently." Silas listened to this carefully. "You're not asking for his operation to be destroyed." "No. He tried to take our ranch." "He did," she said, "and he's going to lose everything he schemed to gain. He's going to spend the next several years with attorneys and investigations and civil claims from 6 other property owners who now know what he did to their valuations." She met Silas's eyes. "That's not mercy. That's just letting the consequences be the consequences without me deciding I also need to choose what kind of man he gets to be afterward." Silas was quiet for a long moment. "My first wife would have liked you," he said. It came out simply, without any particular weight he was trying to give it, and that simplicity made it land harder than anything elaborate could have. Adeline looked at him. "She believed in doing things right," he said. "Not just doing things." He looked at the letter. "Write back to Stanmore. Tell him what you told me." She wrote the letter that evening. The formal response from Crowell's attorney came 10 days later. They did not get everything immediately. These things never resolve immediately, which Stanmore had prepared her for. But what they got was foundational. A signed agreement acknowledging the survey discrepancies, a withdrawal of all claims against Iron Creek, and the initiation of a state-supervised correction process for all 7 affected property assessments. Crowell's water access monopoly in the Northern Valley was formally dissolved as a condition of avoiding full criminal prosecution for the fraudulent filings. He did not come to Iron Creek. He did not send a message. He simply, in the language of legal documents and county records, ceased to be a threat. Adeline received the final confirmation on a Thursday afternoon in January, 4 months and 1 week after she had arrived at Coldwater Ridge with a battered trunk and a practical concern she'd refused to call fear. She read it at the kitchen table, stood up, went to the window and looked at the snow-covered yard and the white mountains and the sky that was doing its enormous Montana thing, indifferent and beautiful, the way it always was. Then she went to find Silas. He was in the barn, which was where he retreated when he needed to think, and he was doing something with a harness that probably didn't need doing as urgently as he was making it look. She stood in the barn doorway and he looked up and read her face. "It's done," he said. "It's done." He set the harness down, stood up, and his leg was nearly right now, the 4 weeks of forced rest having done what they were supposed to do despite his objections. He stood in the middle of his barn and looked at her, and she crossed the barn and handed him the document, and he read it in the way he read things that mattered, completely, carefully, twice. Then he looked up. "Ask me now," he said. She looked at him. "You told me," he said, "weeks ago, that I was allowed to feel like things might be all right. You said ask me again when it's done." The corners of his mouth moved. "It's done. Ask me." "Silas," she said, "are things going to be all right?" "Yes," he said. Simply, immediately, the way he said things he was certain of. "Yes, they are." He reached out and took her hand, her work-worn, cold from the outside, been through a Montana winter hand, and held it, and she let him hold it, and the barn was warm from the animals, and the smell of hay and old wood, and the particular smell of a place that has been worked and cared for a long time. They stood there for a moment, not saying anything, which was exactly right. Then Toby appeared in the barn doorway behind her. "Are you two in here holding hands?" he said. "Yes," Silas said. Toby considered this. "Okay," he said, with the complete acceptance of someone who has decided this development is not problematic. "Mara wants to know if we're eating at noon or 1 because she's planning something." "What is she planning?" Silas said. "She won't tell me. She said it's not for me to know yet." He paused. "I think it might be a cake." Adeline looked at Silas. "Noon," Silas said. Toby disappeared. Silas looked at her. She looked back at him. The barn was warm, and the document was in his hand, and outside the Montana winter was doing exactly what it always did, pressing down from the mountains with its particular heavy permanence, and neither of them was particularly worried about it. "Come on," she said. "Let's go inside." What Mara had been planning was not, in the end, a cake. It was more complicated than that, and more simple. She had set the kitchen table with the tablecloth that usually came out only for particular occasions. The one Adeline had found in the chest in the hall closet in her first week and carefully put back because she wasn't sure whether she was the kind of person who was allowed to use it yet. Mara had put it on the table and set the good dishes and made biscuits from the recipe she'd been practicing since October. They still came out slightly uneven because the stove ran hot on the left side and Mara hadn't fully compensated for it, though she was getting closer. And there was soup that Adeline recognized as following the method she'd demonstrated in November, with the additions Mara had apparently decided on herself. When Adeline walked into the kitchen and saw it, she stopped. Mara was at the stove with her back turned, stirring something, and she didn't turn around immediately. She said without turning, "I heard from Toby that it was good news." "It was," Adeline said. "So I thought—" Mara stirred. "I thought we should eat properly." Adeline stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the tablecloth and the good dishes and the slightly uneven biscuits cooling on the counter, and thought about a girl who had tried to make her leave in the first weeks, standing with careful sideways strategy at the stove, making lunch with the good dishes because it was a day that deserved them. "Thank you, Mara," she said. Mara turned around. Her face had that composed quality her father's had, the controlled surface over something less controlled underneath. She looked at Adeline and then at the table she'd set, and then back at Adeline. "The biscuits on the right side are better," she said. "The left side of the stove is still—" "I know," Adeline said. "We'll fix the damper next week. It's a simple adjustment." Mara nodded, turned back to the soup. Then, as if it were simply the next thing she'd been going to say, "I'm glad you stayed." She set it to the pot on the stove, and it cost her something. Adeline could hear that, the slight roughness in the girl's voice that came from saying aloud a thing you'd been carrying privately. Mara was 10 years old, and she had been managing her grief and her wariness, and her complicated feelings about this stranger who had come into her house with the same careful self-sufficiency her father managed his. And she was standing at the stove in a kitchen she'd set the table in for the first time that wasn't an obligation, and she was saying, "I'm glad you stayed." "Me too," Adeline said. "More than I can tell you." Mara stirred the soup, nodded once, sharply, the way her father closed a subject he'd said what he needed to say about. Then, "It'll be ready in 10 minutes. They ate at noon, the 4 of them, at the properly set table with the tablecloth that was allowed to be used now. And Toby talked continuously about several things, including the rooster's continuing territorial disputes, a rabbit he'd seen near the east fence, and a question about whether horses could learn to recognize specific people by name, which generated a longer conversation than it might have otherwise because both Silas and Adeline had actual information about it. Mara ate her soup and contributed a precise observation about the gray mare's behavior that settled the question more definitively than either adult had managed. Silas looked at his daughter when she said it. She was eating her soup, didn't look up. But she was there, present, talking. At the table in a way she hadn't been, 4 months ago, when Adeline had arrived and Mara had sat with her father's assessing eyes and said nothing and tracked everything and waited to see what kind of person had come into her home. After lunch, when Toby had been dispatched outside with instructions about the afternoon feeding and Mara had gone upstairs with her book, Silas sat at the cleared table with his coffee and was quiet in the particular way he was quiet when he was working something out. Adeline sat across from him. "She said something to you," he said. "In the kitchen." "Yes." "You don't have to tell me what." "She said she was glad I stayed," Adeline said. He looked at his coffee. Something worked through his face that he didn't try to manage into a more acceptable expression, which was new. Silas Rourke in the first months had been a man who kept his interior very firmly interior. This was different. "She doesn't say that kind of thing easily," he said. "I know. That's why it meant something." He looked up at her. The kitchen was quiet, and the winter was outside, and the tablecloth was still on the table, and somewhere upstairs Mara was reading her book, and outside Toby was probably talking to the horses. "I've been thinking," Silas said, "about what this year has been." She waited. "I thought when I wrote that advertisement," he said, "that I needed someone capable. That was the word I kept using, capable. Like I was hiring a ranch hand who could also manage the household and help with the children." He paused. "That was all I thought I was doing." "I know," she said. "I thought so too." "It wasn't." He held her gaze. "Or it was at the start. But it stopped being only that a long time ago." He set his coffee down. I'm not a man who says things like this with any natural ability." "I've noticed," she said, gently. "I'm trying anyway." He looked at her steadily. "You changed what this place is. Not just the legal situation, not just the valley arrangement, what this house is, what my children are becoming, what I am." He stopped. "I don't know what I'm saying exactly." "I think," she said carefully, "you're saying you're glad I answered the advertisement." He looked at her. "Yes, that. But more than that." "Silas." "More than that," he said again, and he reached across the kitchen table and put his hand over hers. And this was different from the barn, which had been him taking her hand in a moment of resolution and relief. This was deliberate and quiet and said everything he didn't have the natural ability to say out loud. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a while, at the kitchen table with the tablecloth on it, in the house that was theirs. The winter that followed was the hardest in 3 years, which was saying something for a Montana valley that set a high bar for hard winters. The cold arrived fully in February and stayed, and there were 2 more storms before March that required everything Iron Creek had in terms of preparation and response. But they had the winter stores, and the hay barn roof had been repaired, and the fence lines were strong, and the water rights were documented and clear. And they had something else now that they hadn't had in October. Neighbors who came when things were difficult. Danner's crew appeared after the first February storm to help clear the South Pasture access road, which had drifted shut overnight. They showed up before Adeline had sent anyone to ask, which told her that Danner had given his people standing instructions, and she filed this away as the kind of information that tells you a lot about what a man actually believes, as opposed to what he says he believes. Orson Vale sent a supply of salt and hay feed after the second storm, delivered by his youngest son with a note in Vale's sparse handwriting that said, "Thought you might need this." OV, no apology, no elaboration. Just a practical acknowledgement, in the language of the valley, that things between them were different now. The Prescott family invited them to a winter gathering in February, and they went, and Adeline sat at a long table full of valley families and ate food she hadn't cooked and listened to conversations that included her without effort, without the 55-degree temperature she'd walked into in October. It was not all warmth and ease. There were people there who still looked at her with the residual wariness of having been wrong about someone, which is its own complicated feeling to sit with. But it was real. It was the valley beginning to behave like a valley, rather than like a collection of isolated operations held in alignment by one man's ambition. Lenora Bell had resumed teaching the Valley children in March, a role she'd apparently held before her husband's arrangement with Crowell had made the associated visibility uncomfortable. She taught in the mornings at the schoolhouse that had been built with great optimism and attended with considerably more now that winter had given people time to remember the value of it. Mara went. She came home the first week with her careful, composed expression and a book Lenora had lent her, and told Adeline at dinner that Mrs. Bell was a very good teacher and expected a great deal from her students, which Mara clearly intended as a compliment. "She expects a great deal from all of them," Adeline said. "Or just from you specifically?" "From me specifically," Mara said, with something in her voice that was not quite pride but was adjacent to it. "She said I have my mother's sharpness." Silas looked at his plate for a moment, then at Mara. "She does," he said. "She does." Mara looked at her soup, but the slight color in her face was not embarrassment. The county investigation concluded in the spring. The formal findings covered all 7 affected properties, documented the systematic nature of the fraudulent assessments, and resulted in corrected state records for every holding involved. Harold Bell had resigned from his position as land registrar before the investigation concluded, preemptively and without drama, and the county had accepted this in lieu of criminal charges given his voluntary cooperation. He and Lenora were still in Coldwater Ridge. She had told Adeline on a Tuesday in late February that they intended to stay, and that Harold was planning to use his knowledge of land documentation to open a private surveying business, which was perhaps the most appropriate possible resolution to his particular history. Adeline had said she thought that was a good idea. She meant it. Crowell was gone from the valley by April. Not fled. There was no dramatic exodus, no public humiliation, just the quiet and comprehensive departure of a man whose leverage has evaporated, and who is practical enough to understand that the place from which you drew your power is no longer that place. His northern ranch was sold to a family from Idaho who had no history with Coldwater Ridge and no interest in acquiring any, which was exactly the kind of uncomplicated new beginning the valley needed. Adeline learned of his departure from Dottie Hatch, who mentioned it with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone reporting a weather change, not triumphant, just noting that the thing had passed. She came home and told Silas. He nodded. That was all. Neither of them needed it to be more than that. By the time the spring came properly to the valley, not the false spring that arrives in March and retreats again, but the real one, the one that commits, Iron Creek Ranch was running better than it had run in years. The accounts were the clearest they'd been since before Silas's first wife died. The herd was healthy, and the numbers were up. The labor-sharing arrangements with neighboring ranches that Adeline had quietly begun negotiating in January were formalized into actual agreements by May, sensible trades of equipment and manpower for particular operations that saved every ranch involved money and time, which in a valley where both were always tight was not a small thing. Bram Kessler had stopped doing the thing he did with his hat when he was worried. He'd stopped doing it in November, around the time he'd poured Adeline's coffee first, and the absence of it was something she noticed in the way you notice when a sound you've been hearing constantly finally stops. In May, Toby asked her something. They were in the yard and he was supposed to be helping with the chicken feed but had become interested in watching a beetle navigate a fence post instead, which was so entirely Toby that she hadn't interrupted it. He was 7 now. His birthday had been in March, a fact she had made sure of with a cake that Mara had helped make, and that had come out considerably better than Mara's first solo attempt, because the damper on the left side of the stove had been fixed in February. He looked up from the beetle and said, without any particular preamble, "Can I call you Mother?" She stood with the chicken feed in her hands. He was looking at her with the direct, uncomplicated openness that was entirely Toby's own quality. No wariness, no strategy, just a question he'd been thinking about and had decided to ask. "Yes," she said, because there was no other answer, and she didn't need to think about it. He nodded, with the satisfied expression of someone who has resolved a question that mattered, and turned back to the beetle. She stood there for a moment with the chicken feed looking at the top of his head. She thought about the Cincinnati apartment, about $34 and a silence that had gone on too long, about an advertisement on a church notice board and a letter that pressed so hard into the paper she could feel the ridges from the other side, about a valley that had looked at her with 55-degree temperature and a man who had dropped a paper at her feet like she wasn't worth the reach. She thought about a surveyor's numbers and Lenora Bell turning pages in a book she wasn't reading and Caleb Danner saying 22 years to a window. About 32 cattle crossing a flooding creek because a mother went into the water for her calf. About Silas at the kitchen table at 4:30 in the morning with his coffee already made. About a girl with her father's eyes who had set a table with the good dishes and said, "I'm glad you stayed to a pot of soup." She scattered the chicken feed. The chickens descended on it with their usual complete absorption in the immediate task, which was one of the things she had come to find genuinely amusing about chickens. Their total commitment to the present moment, their complete absence of concern about anything that was not directly in front of them. There was something almost instructive about it, if you were inclined to look for instructions in chickens, which she was on Good Mornings. Mara came out 3 weeks later. This was not a spontaneous moment. Adeline recognized, in retrospect, that Mara had been building up to it in her careful, deliberate way for at least a week. She'd been slightly more present in the kitchen in the mornings, had asked 2 separate questions about the lamb's wool. They were sorting for winter preparation that she clearly already knew the answers to, had lingered at the kitchen table after supper twice on evenings when Adeline was still working on the accounts. She had been checking, making sure the ground was solid. On a Thursday afternoon, Mara came into the kitchen where Adeline was working through the spring accounts and sat at the table and opened her book. She read for 20 minutes, or appeared to read. Adeline noticed she had not turned a page. Then Mara said, very casually, the way she said things that cost her the most, "I have a question about this chapter." She held up the book. "Would you have a minute to look at it?" "Of course," Adeline said. Mara brought the book over and sat beside her and pointed to a passage, and Adeline read it, and they talked about it for a while. And Mara asked questions that were genuinely about the book and not about anything else. And it was an ordinary afternoon in a kitchen that smelled like the coffee still on the stove and the early summer coming through the window. And then, still looking at the book, while Adeline was in the middle of a sentence, Mara said, "Mama, what do you think it means when the author says—" She kept going. She said the rest of the sentence. She asked her question. She kept her eyes on the book. Adeline answered the question. Her voice was entirely steady. She was very careful about that. When they'd finished talking about the chapter, Mara took the book back to her usual spot at the table and sat down and turned to the next page and read. And she did not reference what she'd said, and Adeline did not reference it either. It hung in the kitchen air between them, not as a declaration or an event, but as a fact that had been quietly established and didn't need any further ceremony. Mara read her book. Adeline did the accounts. Outside, the spring afternoon was doing what spring afternoons did in Montana, when they were good ones. The light coming in at an angle that made the mountains look painted rather than real, the grass already green in the lower pastures, the sound of the ranch in full operation drifting through the open window. Adeline set down her pen and looked at the account books in front of her and thought about a very plain fact. She had come here with nothing. Not nothing literally. She'd had a trunk and $34 and the capacity for hard work and the practical decision to stop waiting for a life to happen to her. But nothing in the sense of no place, no belonging, no person who would notice her absence in the particular way that people notice the absence of someone who is specifically theirs. She had come here expecting to earn her keep and endure the suspicion and survive the winters and build something tolerable. She had not expected this. She had not expected a 6-year-old who asked to call her mother. A 10-year-old who set the table with the good dishes and said mama without fanfare. A man across the kitchen table who reached for her hand and said more than that, and meant it. She had not expected to belong somewhere. That was the thing about it. The thing she hadn't been able to name until this quiet Thursday afternoon, with the spring coming through the window and the accounts in front of her and Mara turning pages nearby. She had been so focused on earning her place that she hadn't noticed the moment when earning stopped being the mechanism and belonging started being the fact. It had not announced itself. It had not arrived with any ceremony. It had simply accumulated, morning by morning, account book by account book, bad weather and hard work, and 32 cattle crossing a flood, and a girl with her father's eyes watching from careful distances until she decided the ground was solid enough. You can't force that. You can't strategize your way to it or earn it through enough demonstrated competence. You can only do the work honestly and stay when it's hard and treat people like they're worth treating well and let the belonging come in its own time, through its own doors. That was the lesson Montana had given her, and she had not expected it from a place that cold and that large and that indifferent. But the best lessons usually come from unexpected directions. That evening, Silas rode in from the north pasture in the early dark and came into the kitchen still in his coat, which he always did, and Adeline always looked at it, which she no longer tried to stop doing. He looked at the kitchen, Toby at the counter doing something inadvisable with a biscuit, Mara at the table, and his eyes found Adeline's, the way they did now, the automatic finding, like water finding level. "Good day?" he said. "Very good," she said. He looked at her face, read something in it. "Tell me later," he said. "Later," she agreed. He went to hang up his coat. They ate supper. Toby told a story about Bram that was probably 30% accurate and 100% entertaining. Mara made a precise and quietly devastating observation about the rooster's strategic intelligence that silenced the table for a full second before Silas started laughing. Actually laughing, the real version, not the controlled almost smile. And then everyone was laughing, including Mara, who tried not to and failed. After supper, after the children were in bed, Adeline and Silas sat on the porch in the spring evening with the stars out and the mountains dark and enormous in the distance. And she told him about Mara and the book and the word that had appeared in the middle of a sentence and not been made into a ceremony. He listened with his elbows on his knees and his hands together and his face doing the thing it did when something hit him in the place he kept most protected. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "She waited until she was sure," he said. "Yes." "She's been sure for a while," he said. "She was just waiting until she was ready to say it." "I think so." He looked at the mountains. "She's more like her mother than I sometimes let myself see," he said. "Her mother took her time about things, too. Wouldn't say something until she'd decided she meant it." A pause. "When she said something, she meant it completely." "Mara does too," Adeline said. "Yes." He looked at her. "So do you." The porch was quiet. The spring night was mild enough to sit in, which was still new enough to appreciate after the winter they'd come through. "Silas," she said. "I know," he said. "I know what I want to say. I just—" He shook his head slightly. "I keep trying to find the right order for it." "You don't have to find the right order," she said. "Just say it." He looked at her steadily. "I love you," he said. Not as an event, not building to it. Just, there it is plainly, the way he said things he'd assessed and decided were true. It's been longer than I've let on, but I wanted to be sure I was saying it because it was real and not because I was grateful or, Silas, she said, or because it was easier than, Silas. He stopped. "I love you too," she said. "I've been waiting for you to stop finding reasons to wait." He looked at her. "You're a very thorough man," she said. "You're saying I overthought it." "I'm saying you assessed it from every possible angle before concluding it was accurate, which is very much how you do everything." It's one of the things I love about you," she said, "along with the fact that you sent me to Millhaven alone because you understood I was right about it, and that you told Bram to use the good wire for Danner's fence, and that you left the porch light on." He held her gaze. "The porch light." "The night I came back from Danner's," she said. "It was dark and you left the light on. You or one of the children, but someone thought of it." "Mara," he said. "She said you'd need to see the yard." Adeline sat with that for a moment. Then Silas reached over and took her hand, and she leaned her shoulder against his, and they looked at the Montana night together, which went on for a very long time in every direction and didn't care about any of it, which was somehow exactly right. The indifference of large things had stopped feeling hostile to her somewhere in the winter. It had started feeling like honesty. The mountains didn't care, the sky didn't care. The valley had its own long history that had nothing to do with her. And she was here anyway, and it was enough, it was more than enough, to be one small human thing in the middle of all that enormity, with her shoulder against the shoulder of a man who had finally said the plain true thing. "Ask me something," Silas said. She looked at him. "You've been asking me things all year," he said. "Whenever I needed to hear them, ask me one more." She thought about it. "Are you happy?" she said. He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "Ask me again tomorrow." "I'll ask you every day," she said. "Good," he said. "I'll keep answering." The spring night settled around Iron Creek Ranch, over the repaired fences and the documented water rights, and the sound of cattle in the lower pasture, over the kitchen with the tablecloth that was allowed to be used now, over two children sleeping in the house with the particular ease of people who have finally stopped waiting for something to be taken from them. The woman who had arrived with a battered trunk and a practical concern she'd refused to call fear sat on the porch of her home with her hand in her husband's and understood the plain true thing she'd learned this year, which was this: belonging is not given. It is not granted by a community or assigned by ceremony or earned through enough demonstrated competence. It accumulates. It comes from staying when staying is hard, from doing the right thing when the wrong thing would be easier, from treating frightened people like they deserve better than their fear, from leaving the porch light on. She had survived Montana not by becoming harder than it. She had survived by becoming more herself than she had ever been in Cincinnati, more honest, more capable, more willing to act on what she believed even when the outcome wasn't certain. And that self had found, in a valley that had initially wanted nothing to do with her, a place that fit. The stars over Montana were very bright. Neither of them